The hallway was almost empty when the first reports quietly surfaced. Fluorescent lights reflected against polished Pentagon floors, while security doors opened and closed somewhere in the distance, creating soft mechanical echoes that disappeared into silence. Nothing about the moment felt historic. There were no emergency broadcasts, no dramatic speeches, no sudden admission that humanity had discovered something beyond understanding. Instead, the information appeared gradually, scattered across government websites, buried inside defense language that most people would never read unless they were searching for it intentionally. For decades, unidentified objects in American airspace existed inside an uncomfortable space between ridicule and secrecy. Officially, the subject rarely deserved serious attention. Publicly, jokes traveled faster than evidence. Yet, somewhere behind closed doors, investigations continued quietly year after year. Radar recordings were archived, pilot testimonies were collected. Intelligence officials asked questions that never reached ordinary citizens. The mystery remained alive, but hidden beneath layers of denial, embarrassment, and national security language designed to reveal almost nothing at all. Then the language began changing. Government officials stopped using familiar phrases connected to flying saucers or UFOs. In their place appeared colder, more careful words. Unidentified anomalous phenomena. The term sounded clinical, almost emotionless, but that made it stranger somehow. Bureaucracies rarely invent new vocabulary without reason. Journalists noticed the shift immediately. Military analysts noticed it even faster. The government was no longer laughing openly at the phenomenon. It was reorganizing the way it discussed it. That subtle change created a feeling difficult to ignore. Late at night, people began reading declassified files that described objects moving against powerful winds without visible propulsion. Reports mentioned radar operators tracking sudden accelerations no known aircraft should survive. Pilots described smooth white shapes hovering silently before vanishing with impossible speed. None of the documents offered satisfying conclusions. In many cases, investigators simply admitted the encounters remained unresolved. That uncertainty became the most unsettling detail of all. The Pentagon had spent decades presenting itself as one of the most advanced military institutions on Earth. Satellites monitored hostile territory from orbit. Nuclear submarines crossed oceans undetected. Surveillance systems could identify movement from enormous distances. Yet hidden inside newly released reports were quiet acknowledgements that certain objects entering restricted airspace could not be confidently identified. Not aliens, not foreign aircraft, simply unknown. The reaction was strangely subdued at first. Former skeptics stared at the documents with cautious confusion rather than excitement. Some journalists dismissed the reports as exaggerated military misunderstandings. Others became fascinated by the careful wording surrounding the investigations. Ordinary people scrolled past headlines without realizing how unusual the situation actually was. The mystery did not arrive like a science fiction film. It entered public awareness softly, almost reluctantly, which somehow made it feel more believable. Because governments know how to deny things clearly. What disturbed many observers was not confirmation, but hesitation. Officials repeatedly avoided absolute statements. They acknowledged encounters while refusing explanation. They confirmed footage while avoiding conclusions. And behind every carefully chosen sentence lingered the same uncomfortable possibility. Something had entered protected military space repeatedly, and the most powerful defense systems on Earth could not fully explain what it was. As more files surfaced quietly from the shadows of classified archives, a deeper question slowly emerged beneath the public conversation. If the Pentagon investigated these incidents seriously for years, what exactly had military personnel been witnessing in the skies above the ocean? The answer did not arrive immediately. Instead, it waited behind fragments of testimony, blurred recordings, interrupted radar tracks, and conversations that sounded incomplete even inside official briefings. The deeper people looked into the files, the stranger the atmosphere surrounding them became. The documents were not dramatic enough to feel fictional, yet not ordinary enough to dismiss comfortably. They carried the feeling of a locked door left slightly open, revealing just enough darkness beyond it to make silence different. Far from cities and headlines, the encounters unfolded above enormous stretches of dark water, where military radar swept constantly through empty skies. Navy pilots launched routinely from aircraft carriers, believing they understood the environment around them completely. Every object in restricted airspace was supposed to have an explanation. Every movement was supposed to follow recognizable physics. Yet somewhere above the Pacific, certainty began slipping quietly apart. The reports often started the same way. Radar operators noticed strange returns descending from extreme altitude with impossible speed before stopping abruptly above the ocean surface. At first, technicians assumed equipment malfunction. Systems were recalibrated repeatedly, but the objects continued appearing. They dropped tens of thousands of feet within seconds, hovered motionless against violent winds, then accelerated beyond tracking range without producing visible exhaust or heat signatures expected from conventional aircraft. Pilots were eventually sent to investigate. Many later described the experience with uncomfortable restraint, which made the accounts feel more unsettling. They did not sound like people telling ghost stories. Some sounded embarrassed to discuss what they witnessed at all. One pilot described arriving at a designated location and seeing disturbed water below, as though something large had just submerged beneath the surface. Hovering above it was a smooth white object, shaped almost like a tic-tac, featureless and silent against the open sky. Then it moved. Not gradually, not with the steady acceleration expected from normal aircraft. The object changed direction instantly, crossing enormous distance in moments without visible propulsion. Pilots attempting to intercept it found themselves reacting too slowly, as though the object anticipated their maneuvers before they happened. In some encounters, radar systems detected the object reappearing miles away, only seconds later, already waiting near the pilot's predetermined meeting point. That detail lingered in military discussions long afterward. Experienced aviators trusted their perception because their profession demanded it. These were individuals trained to operate advanced combat aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars under extreme conditions. They understood speed, altitude, distance, and motion intuitively. Yet many struggled afterward to explain what they had seen, without sounding irrational even to themselves. The deeper concern emerged slowly. These incidents were not isolated. Weeks passed. Then months. Crews returning from missions reportedly encountered similar objects repeatedly inside heavily monitored military training zones. Some personnel eventually stopped reacting with surprise because the appearances became strangely routine. Unknown objects hovered near exercises, vanished into clouds, or accelerated beyond visible range before anyone could identify them clearly. The mystery changed shape at that point. The question was no longer whether one pilot misidentified something unusual. The question became why unexplained craft kept appearing inside some of the most restricted airspace on Earth. Publicly, very little was said. Privately, the atmosphere reportedly became more serious. Intelligence officials requested briefings. Recordings were archived. Reports moved upward through military channels. Yet the pilots themselves often remained calm in interviews, almost detached from the emotional weight surrounding the encounters. That contrast created an unsettling impression. The people witnessing the objects firsthand seemed less frightened than the institutions reviewing the data behind closed doors. Some encounters became stranger after review. Infrared footage captured objects rotating without visible wings while maintaining steady velocity against hurricane-force winds. Radar specialists compared data from multiple systems, hoping one instrument would contradict the others, yet the information continued aligning with disturbing consistency. Even skeptical analysts admitted the events resisted ordinary explanation. The objects did not behave like weather balloons, experimental drones, or distant aircraft viewed under unusual conditions. They behaved like something operating according to rules military observers could detect, but could not understand. Night after night, aircraft carriers continued drifting through black ocean water, while radar systems searched the skies above them. Somewhere beyond ordinary visibility, unknown objects continued appearing briefly before disappearing again without explanation. And slowly, the ocean itself began feeling less like empty space, and more like a boundary between the known world and something operating just beyond it. As the reports accumulated inside classified investigations, another question emerged quietly beneath the surface. If military personnel encountered these objects repeatedly, why did officials spend so many years minimizing the incidents publicly instead of confronting them openly? The deeper the reports traveled into Washington, the quieter the conversation became. Inside secure offices and classified briefing rooms, the language surrounding unidentified aerial phenomena changed carefully over time. but the atmosphere around it changed even more. Publicly, officials continued speaking with caution, often dismissing speculation while refusing to fully reject the encounters themselves. Privately, something more uncertain appeared to be unfolding beneath the surface of official statements. For decades, the government's relationship with unexplained aerial sightings followed a strange and repetitive pattern. Reports would surface briefly, attract public curiosity, then disappear behind layers of bureaucracy until attention faded naturally. Investigations opened under one name would quietly close before similar programs emerged later under different titles. Files were archived, witnesses were interviewed, certain records vanished completely. Others resurfaced years later, heavily redacted, fragmented into pieces that revealed just enough information to create deeper confusion. What became increasingly noticeable was not simply secrecy, but inconsistency. Different agencies often appeared unable to maintain a unified explanation. One department minimized the encounters, while another continued funding investigations quietly in the background. Military officials denied knowledge publicly, while intelligence personnel requested additional analysis privately. The contradictions created an unsettling impression that information was not being hidden cleanly. It was being managed carefully because nobody inside the system fully understood the situation either. Former intelligence officials occasionally hinted at this uncertainty without describing it directly. Congressional discussions surfaced briefly before moving behind closed doors. Leaked memos referenced objects displaying unusual flight characteristics while avoiding conclusions about origin or intent. The deeper journalists pushed into the story, the more fragmented the answers became. Instead of uncovering one hidden truth, investigators found layers of compartmentalized confusion, separated across agencies that rarely communicated openly, even with each other. That detail changed the emotional atmosphere completely. The mystery no longer centered entirely around unidentified objects in the sky. It began revolving around institutions struggling to maintain certainty in situations where certainty may not have existed at all. The possibility emerged slowly and quietly, but once noticed, it became difficult to ignore. Perhaps secrecy was never protecting a complete answer. Perhaps secrecy was protecting vulnerability itself. That realization disturbed some lawmakers more than the encounters. Members of Congress reportedly requested access to classified briefings, only to encounter resistance from parts of the intelligence community. Certain officials appeared frustrated by how little information they could obtain, despite holding positions of significant authority. Public hearings revealed careful wording and visible discomfort whenever direct questions surfaced about unidentified aerial phenomena inside military airspace. Even experienced politicians accustomed to national security, secrecy seemed unsettled by the fragmented nature of the responses. The silence surrounding the topic started feeling deliberate in a different way. For generations, the American military projected an image of overwhelming awareness and control. Radar systems monitored skies continuously. Intelligence networks tracked potential threats globally. The public believed advanced defense institutions understood far more than ordinary citizens ever would. Admitting that unknown objects repeatedly entered protected airspace without explanation threatened more than reputation. It threatened confidence in the system itself. That may have been the most psychologically dangerous aspect of the phenomenon. If officials openly acknowledged uncertainty surrounding objects displaying impossible behavior, difficult questions would follow naturally. Were these advanced foreign technologies, hidden aerospace programs, sensor anomalies nobody understood, or something operating entirely outside familiar categories? Every possibility carried consequences. Every explanation revealed vulnerability somewhere inside the structure of modern power. So the language remained cautious. Statements became softer rather than clearer. Officials confirmed investigations while avoiding certainty. Encounters were acknowledged without explanation. Information emerged slowly enough to prevent panic, yet steadily enough to suggest the issue could no longer remain buried completely. Washington continued functioning normally on the surface, but beneath that appearance, fragments of uncertainty moved quietly through classified corridors. And as more documents surfaced from deeper inside military archives, another question began forming beyond the walls of the Pentagon itself. If these encounters created confusion inside modern government institutions, were they truly new events? Or had similar incidents been hidden quietly across decades of military history long before the public ever noticed them? Long before modern Pentagon footage appeared online, The mystery had already been moving quietly through military history for decades. The newly released files felt recent only because they reached public attention recently. In reality, similar reports stretched backward through generations of classified archives, forgotten investigations, and incidents discussed briefly before fading into silence again. The deeper researchers looked into historical records, the more the timeline began feeling less like isolated events and more like a pattern repeating beneath history itself. In the late 1940s, pilots reported metallic objects moving at impossible speeds across military airspace. Radar systems tracked targets performing abrupt turns no aircraft should survive. At first, officials feared secret foreign technology. The Cold War had transformed uncertainty into a form of national anxiety. Anything unidentified in the sky immediately carried military significance. Intelligence officers searched desperately for evidence that rival nations had developed breakthrough aerospace capabilities capable of bypassing American defenses. But some incidents became difficult to fit inside ordinary strategic explanations. Certain objects accelerated too quickly. Others hovered silently before disappearing without visible propulsion. Pilots described machines lacking wings, exhaust, or recognizable structure altogether. In several reports, aircraft instrumentation malfunctioned unexpectedly during encounters. Engines failed temporarily. Communication systems produced interference. Yet when investigators attempted reconstructing the events afterward, witnesses from separate locations often described nearly identical behavior despite never communicating with one another directly. That consistency lingered inside military discussions for years. One naval encounter involved radar operators tracking unknown objects, descending rapidly from high altitude before stopping instantly above the ocean surface. Another case described fighter pilots pursuing luminous aerial shapes capable of sudden acceleration beyond anything publicly known at the time. Decades later, modern military personnel would describe remarkably similar movements using far more advanced radar systems. The technology surrounding the observations changed completely, yet the behavior of the objects remained strangely familiar. The reports changed, the witnesses changed, even the decades changed. But the descriptions continued, returning in forms that felt disturbingly recognizable. Archival documents later revealed how seriously some of these incidents affected national security officials behind closed doors. Publicly, certain encounters were dismissed as weather balloons, misidentified aircraft, or optical illusions. Privately, however, military analysts sometimes expressed deep concern regarding the observed maneuvers. Some officials reportedly concluded that the technology involved exceeded known engineering capabilities, not only in practice, but even in theory. That realization created quiet panic. Because if the objects represented foreign technology, then military balance itself had shifted dangerously. Yet, if no nation possessed such capabilities, another possibility emerged that officials struggled to define openly. Neither explanation offered comfort. Both suggested vulnerabilities existing far beyond public awareness. Witnesses who reported encounters often paid unexpected personal costs. Pilots feared damaging their careers by describing impossible sightings officially. Radar operators worried colleagues would question their judgment. Some military personnel learned quickly that discussing unexplained incidents openly invited ridicule more reliably than support. Silence became easier. Reports were minimized, forgotten, or buried beneath ordinary administrative language until years passed, and memory itself softened around the edges. But the cases never disappeared completely. Fragments resurfaced repeatedly through leaked memoranda, retired military testimony, and newly declassified records that hinted at investigations continuing long after the public assumed the subject had ended. Each generation seemed to rediscover the mystery independently, believing it had encountered something entirely new before realizing eerily similar reports already existed decades earlier. That repetition slowly transformed the emotional atmosphere surrounding the phenomenon. The mystery no longer depended upon one dramatic event or one extraordinary witness. Instead, it survived through accumulation. Small consistencies repeated across time with uncomfortable persistence. Unknown objects tracked on radar, silent craft accelerating impossibly fast, equipment interference, military concern hidden behind public dismissal. The details resurfaced too often to ignore comfortably, yet never clearly enough to produce definitive answers. By the time the Pentagon Files entered modern public discussion, A deeper realization had already begun emerging beneath the surface. These encounters did not feel like isolated incidents anymore. They felt like pieces of a much older story moving quietly through modern history, while remaining permanently unfinished. And within that unfinished history waited another layer of the mystery even more unsettling than unexplained aircraft alone. Again and again, unidentified objects appeared near humanity's most dangerous weapons. The atmosphere surrounding the phenomenon changed completely once investigators noticed where certain encounters were happening. Unknown objects did not simply appear over isolated deserts or distant oceans. Again and again, reports emerged from locations connected to nuclear weapons, missile installations, and strategic military facilities built during the Cold War. The pattern became difficult to ignore because these were among the most heavily protected sites on Earth, surrounded by armed personnel, radar systems, and constant surveillance. During the height of nuclear tension between world powers, military officers stationed near missile silos began reporting strange lights hovering silently above restricted zones late at night. Some described glowing objects remaining perfectly motionless in the sky for extended periods before accelerating away without sound. Others recalled luminous shapes maneuvering directly above launch facilities where intercontinental nuclear missiles remained on constant alert beneath the ground. At first, officials feared espionage. The possibility that foreign governments possessed advanced surveillance technology capable of penetrating secure nuclear defenses created immediate concern. Investigations opened quietly. Witnesses were interviewed behind closed doors. Security procedures tightened. Yet certain details emerging from the reports did not align comfortably with ordinary reconnaissance activity. Several military personnel later claimed that missile systems malfunctioned shortly after unidentified objects appeared overhead. In some testimonies, launch controls reportedly shut down temporarily without clear explanation. Warning systems activated unexpectedly. Electronic failures spread across facilities designed with multiple layers of redundancy, specifically intended to prevent disruption. Engineers searched for technical causes, while officers attempted understanding whether the incidents represented sabotage, equipment failure, or something even stranger. The reports remained fragmented and controversial, but the emotional impact inside military circles was significant. For the first time, the unknown appeared connected not only to airspace violations, but to humanity's most destructive technology. Nuclear weapons represented absolute power during the Cold War. Entire military strategies depended upon the assumption that these systems remained secure, predictable, and fully controlled. The idea that unidentified objects might interfere with them introduced a form of uncertainty almost impossible to discuss publicly. Then, another disturbing detail surfaced quietly through declassified testimony and historical investigations. The incidents were not isolated to one country. Military archives and witness accounts suggested that similar encounters occurred near nuclear facilities across multiple nations, including governments deeply hostile toward one another. Reports emerged from Soviet military personnel, describing luminous aerial objects near strategic installations during periods of intense geopolitical tension. Other cases appeared near British and European weapons facilities. Different governments, different languages, different political systems, yet strangely similar descriptions continued resurfacing across decades. That realization expanded the scale of the mystery dramatically. The pattern no longer felt local or accidental. It felt global. The emotional weight surrounding these encounters became especially heavy for officers responsible for nuclear deterrence. Their profession revolved around maintaining stability through absolute control over catastrophic weapons systems. Yet some privately admitted they encountered situations that challenged their confidence completely. Unknown objects appearing near missile sites created questions nobody inside military command structures could answer comfortably. Why those locations? The documentary never offers certainty, because certainty never fully existed within the records themselves. Some investigators believed the objects simply monitored areas of strategic importance because nuclear facilities generated intense military activity and surveillance. Others quietly wondered whether the phenomenon demonstrated specific interest in humanity's growing destructive capability. A few dismissed the pattern entirely as coincidence shaped by selective memory and Cold War paranoia. But the reports continued accumulating. Witnesses described hovering lights near missile fields. Radar operators tracked unexplained aerial movements over restricted facilities. Security personnel reported objects capable of sudden acceleration beyond known aircraft performance. The same details surfaced repeatedly across generations, creating an atmosphere where coincidence alone felt increasingly difficult to accept emotionally. And beneath every discussion lingered the same haunting possibility. If unidentified objects repeatedly approached nuclear systems, what exactly did that mean? Observation? Warning? Curiosity? Surveillance? Or something humanity still lacked the conceptual framework to understand at all? No explanation resolved the discomfort entirely, because the phenomenon now touched something deeper than military secrecy. It reached into questions of survival itself. Nuclear weapons represented humanity's ability to destroy civilization completely. The idea that unknown intelligence, unknown technology, or unknown forces might interact with those systems transformed the mystery into something existential. By the end of these investigations, officials no longer seemed certain whether the phenomenon should be feared, studied, hidden, or understood. And as governments quietly encountered similar patterns across decades, another difficult question slowly emerged behind the classified reports. If military institutions repeatedly observed these incidents, how exactly did they attempt explaining them internally without admitting how little they truly understood? For decades, governments, scientists, military analysts, and skeptics attempted to force the mystery into categories that felt manageable. Every generation believed it stood close to resolving the phenomenon permanently. New technology arrived. Better radar systems emerged. Intelligence capabilities expanded. Human beings entered the space age convinced that modern science and surveillance would eventually reduce every unexplained event into understandable pieces. Yet the deeper investigators looked, the less stable certainty became. Some explanations appeared reasonable at first. Experimental military aircraft accounted for certain sightings during the Cold War, especially near restricted testing zones, where classified aerospace projects remained hidden from the public. Atmospheric distortions explained unusual lights under rare conditions. Equipment malfunction accounted for isolated radar anomalies. Human perception, especially under stress or darkness, introduced opportunities for misidentification naturally. But the mystery survived each explanation, because the details refused to align neatly. Radar failures alone could not explain trained pilots visually observing the same objects simultaneously. Psychological contagion did not account comfortably for incidents involving independent military witnesses separated by geography and decades. Atmospheric phenomena rarely accelerated intelligently against strong winds before disappearing beyond radar range. Experimental aircraft theories solved some encounters while creating larger questions about technology, supposedly capable of impossible maneuvers generations ahead of public engineering. Even skepticism encountered limits eventually. Some analysts argued the reports represented a cultural feedback loop where expectation shaped interpretation. Popular media influenced perception. Pilots exposed to UFO stories might unconsciously exaggerate ordinary anomalies into extraordinary experiences. Yet this explanation weakened when historical records revealed remarkably similar descriptions emerging long before modern UFO culture became widespread. The consistency remained difficult to dismiss entirely. Then there was the possibility many officials feared discussing openly: adversarial technology. Military intelligence agencies repeatedly considered whether foreign governments had secretly developed aerospace capabilities far beyond publicly known systems. During periods of geopolitical tension, this possibility generated serious concern behind closed doors, but investigations often reached uncomfortable conclusions. Certain maneuvers described within classified reports exceeded not only current engineering expectations, but theoretical limitations surrounding propulsion, acceleration, and structural survivability itself. That realization produced a strange psychological trap. If the objects represented foreign technology, then global military balance had shifted catastrophically without warning. Yet, if no known nation possessed such capabilities, other explanations became increasingly difficult to avoid considering. None of the possibilities felt reassuring. Every path towards certainty seemed to collapse into deeper uncertainty instead. The Pentagon's greatest frustration may never have been public belief in UFOs at all. It may have been the inability to eliminate explanations confidently. That uncertainty carried strategic consequences. Military institutions depend upon classification, prediction, and threat assessment. Unknown objects repeatedly entering restricted airspace without reliable identification created vulnerabilities impossible to measure accurately. Officials could not dismiss the encounters entirely, but neither could they define them clearly enough to control the narrative surrounding them. Modern technology only intensified the contradiction. Advanced radar systems tracked impossible movement patterns with increasing precision. Infrared cameras captured objects lacking expected heat signatures. Satellite surveillance expanded global observation capabilities dramatically. Yet better sensors did not simplify the mystery. In many cases, they reinforced it. Multiple systems occasionally confirmed the same anomalies simultaneously, while still failing to explain what exactly they recorded. More information produced less clarity. That may have been the most unsettling development of all. Human civilization entered the modern age believing mystery itself would gradually disappear beneath scientific understanding. Darkness would become mapped. Unknown territory would shrink. Every unexplained phenomenon would eventually surrender its secrets to technology and reason. Yet somewhere above restricted oceans, missile installations, and military training zones, objects continued appearing that resisted comfortable explanation generation after generation. Not consistently enough to produce certainty, not randomly enough to ignore completely. And slowly, governments began admitting this publicly in ways that would have sounded impossible decades earlier. Officials confirmed investigations without conclusions. Military footage entered public discussion. Lawmakers demanded answers nobody seemed capable of providing fully. The mystery no longer survived only in rumors or conspiracy culture. It existed inside official uncertainty itself. That realization changed the emotional landscape surrounding the phenomenon forever. Because once uncertainty becomes institutional, the question grows larger than hidden aircraft or classified investigations alone. It begins touching something deeper about the modern world itself. If unidentified phenomena repeatedly appeared throughout military history without clear resolution, perhaps the pattern extended beyond one government, one nation, or one generation entirely. Perhaps humanity had been encountering fragments of the same mystery across the world for far longer than anyone realized. The mystery began feeling different once the investigation moved beyond American borders. For years, public discussion surrounding unidentified aerial phenomena focused heavily on the Pentagon, the United States military, and classified American programs hidden behind layers of secrecy. But as researchers slowly examined international archives, witness testimony, and declassified foreign records, another realization emerged quietly beneath the surface. The Pentagon was never alone in its uncertainty. Across distant military installations, frozen northern landscapes, remote coastal radar stations, and isolated air bases scattered around the world, remarkably similar encounters had been unfolding for decades. In Russia, military personnel described unknown objects maneuvering near strategic facilities during periods of intense Cold War tension. In South America, pilots tracked luminous craft crossing restricted airspace before accelerating beyond visual range. Along European coastlines, radar systems detected unexplained aerial movements that generated private military concern while producing little public explanation. Different nations, different governments, different ideologies, yet the same atmosphere surrounded the reports almost everywhere. Publicly, officials responded with caution, dismissal, or silence. Privately, investigations continued far more seriously than ordinary citizens realized. Files disappeared into intelligence archives. Witnesses received warnings against discussing incidents openly. Reports were rewritten using bureaucratic language that concealed uncertainty beneath technical terminology. Even countries deeply distrustful of one another appeared strangely similar in how they managed the phenomenon internally. That consistency created a powerful emotional shift, because secrecy itself began feeling international. One French investigation during the late 20th century examined multiple military and civilian encounters involving radar confirmation and trained observers. Instead of dismissing the reports entirely, some officials openly acknowledged that certain incidents resisted conventional explanation. In Brazil, military personnel documented unusual aerial phenomena during operations that reportedly involved visual observation, radar tracking, and prolonged surveillance over populated regions. Portions of those investigations later became public quietly, revealing that some governments treated the subject with far greater seriousness than popular culture suggested. The public rarely noticed. Most people still associated UFO discussions with tabloids, science fiction, or conspiracy theories circulating at the edges of mainstream conversation. Yet beneath that perception, fragments of official concern surfaced repeatedly across continents. Pilots described silent objects moving unpredictably against strong winds. Radar operators tracked targets capable of sudden acceleration. Military witnesses reported encounters difficult to explain comfortably through ordinary atmospheric conditions or equipment malfunction alone. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the reports often sounded strangely familiar despite enormous geographical separation. In one country, a pilot described a glowing object maintaining impossible speed before vanishing instantly. Years later, a radar operator thousands of miles away reported nearly identical movement patterns during an unrelated incident. Witnesses separated by language, culture, and political systems continued describing smooth metallic craft, silent hovering, abrupt directional changes, and maneuvers exceeding conventional aircraft capability. The details returned repeatedly like fragments of the same unfinished story. Some governments eventually admitted this uncertainty more openly than others. France publicly released portions of investigative files decades before similar transparency appeared inside the United States. Other nations quietly acknowledged that certain encounters remained unresolved after official analysis concluded. None offered definitive explanations. But the willingness to admit uncertainty itself revealed something important. The phenomenon persisted globally. That realization transformed the emotional scale of the mystery entirely. Unidentified aerial phenomena no longer felt connected to one military institution or one nation's hidden programs. The pattern extended across oceans, borders, and generations with strange persistence. Governments that distrusted each other politically often responded to the encounters in eerily similar ways. Cautious denial publicly, deeper concern privately. The audience slowly begins understanding something unsettling. If rival nations independently encountered similar anomalies over decades, then the phenomenon may exist outside ordinary geopolitical narratives entirely. The mystery behaves less like a secret weapon hidden by one government and more like a recurring shadow moving quietly through modern history itself. Still, no final answer emerges. The documentary never claims these objects are extraterrestrial, supernatural, or even technological in the conventional sense. Instead, the uncertainty deepens through repetition. The same patterns continue surfacing across continents with enough consistency to provoke concern, yet never clearly enough to resolve the mystery completely. And as the global pattern becomes impossible to ignore, another disturbing question begins forming naturally beneath the surface. If these encounters occurred repeatedly across decades and continents, why did witnesses who never met each other continue describing the same impossible behavior with such eerie consistency? At first, the reports seemed too fragmented to form any meaningful pattern. Different decades produced different language. Witnesses described objects under different skies, inside different political systems, using entirely different cultural references. Some called them discs. Others described glowing spheres, triangles, or smooth white shapes without visible structure at all. Investigators assumed inconsistency itself proved the phenomenon lacked credibility. But over time, another possibility emerged quietly beneath the contradictions. The similarities were becoming difficult to ignore. Military pilots separated by generations described silent craft, accelerating instantly without visible propulsion. Radar operators in different countries reported targets appearing suddenly before disappearing from tracking systems almost impossibly fast. Civilian witnesses standing in isolated fields late at night described hovering lights remaining motionless for extended periods before vanishing without sound. The details changed slightly each time, but certain patterns repeated with strange persistence. That repetition became psychologically unsettling precisely because it unfolded so slowly. No single encounter proved anything alone. But when investigators compared archived Cold War reports with modern Pentagon testimony, familiar descriptions continued surfacing again and again. Smooth metallic objects, abrupt directional changes, extreme acceleration, silent hovering against strong winds, movements appearing to ignore inertia itself. The same impossible behavior echoed quietly through decades of military archives like fragments of a signal nobody fully understood. The objects looked different enough to remain uncertain, yet similar enough to suggest a pattern nobody wanted to acknowledge. One pilot during the 1950s described a luminous object crossing the horizon before stopping instantly in mid-air. Decades later, Navy aviators reported nearly identical movement patterns during encounters over the Pacific Ocean. Radar specialists from separate generations recorded sudden accelerations beyond conventional aircraft capability, despite enormous advances in detection technology between those eras. That detail carried enormous emotional weight. Because technology surrounding the observations evolved dramatically over time, radar systems improved, infrared imaging advanced, satellite surveillance expanded globally. Human beings transformed from early Cold War aviation into a civilization capable of monitoring vast portions of Earth continuously from orbit. Yet the phenomenon itself appeared strangely unchanged. The same impossible details kept returning. The documentary avoids dramatic conclusions intentionally. Instead, the emotional tension grows through quiet accumulation. Witness after witness describes similar experiences without knowing others already reported nearly identical encounters years earlier. The audience begins connecting the fragments independently, which makes the pattern feel more disturbing than any direct explanation could provide. And beneath the technical descriptions existed something deeply human. Many witnesses did not describe overwhelming fear during the encounters themselves. They described confusion, silence, a strange inability to process what they had witnessed comfortably. Pilots accustomed to extreme situations sometimes struggled more afterward while attempting to explain the events rationally. Some avoided discussing the incidents entirely because they feared sounding unstable. Others replayed the encounters mentally for years, searching for ordinary explanations that never fully satisfied them. That emotional realism grounded the mystery in an unsettling way. These were not theatrical stories told dramatically around campfires. Most witnesses sounded cautious, uncertain, sometimes even reluctant. Their discomfort came not from claiming impossible things confidently, but from recognizing that what they observed resisted explanation completely. In many cases, they appeared less interested in proving extraordinary claims than in understanding why the events felt so strangely consistent across time. Even civilians with no military background often described similar emotional reactions. A hovering light observed briefly above a rural road. A silent triangular shape crossing the night sky without sound. Metallic reflections disappearing behind clouds impossibly fast. The encounters rarely lasted long enough to produce certainty, yet they lingered afterward in memory with unusual intensity. As the reports accumulated across generations, coincidence became increasingly difficult to accept emotionally. Not because every witness told identical stories, but because the same behavioral patterns continued appearing beneath the differences. Sudden acceleration, silent movement, abrupt disappearance, unexplained hovering, repeated proximity to military installations. The details surfaced too consistently to feel entirely random, yet never clearly enough to reveal what the phenomenon actually was. And slowly, the mystery began changing shape again. The audience no longer feels like humanity is observing isolated anomalies scattered accidentally across history. Instead, something appears to follow recognizable patterns while remaining just outside complete human understanding. The phenomenon behaves less like chaos and more like repetition without explanation. By the end of the section, repetition itself becomes frightening. Because accidental mysteries usually fade over time, this one kept returning. And behind every archived report, every radar track, and every witness testimony waited another layer of the story far quieter and more personal than the encounters themselves. The people who carried these experiences silently for years. Behind every radar track, classified memo, and military report existed something quieter and far more human. Long after official investigations ended and headlines disappeared, the witnesses themselves remained. Pilots returned home. Radar technicians continued ordinary careers. Intelligence personnel moved into retirement. Civilians resumed daily life beneath familiar skies. Yet for many of them, the encounter never fully ended. It remained suspended somewhere in memory. The documentary turns away from governments and technology here, focusing instead on the people who carried these experiences silently through years, sometimes decades, without fully understanding what they witnessed. Many never intended to speak publicly at all. Some avoided discussing the incidents with family members. Others buried the memory beneath routine life because explaining it felt impossible without inviting ridicule, suspicion, or isolation. That silence became part of the phenomenon itself. Military personnel often faced difficult choices after reporting encounters officially. Pilots worried colleagues might question their judgment. Radar operators feared being viewed as unreliable. In professions built upon precision and credibility, admitting contact with something unexplained carried quiet social risk. Some witnesses later admitted they spent years trying to convince themselves they had simply misunderstood what happened. But the memory refused to disappear completely. A former pilot might forget ordinary flights over time, while still remembering one strange object crossing the horizon decades earlier with impossible speed. A radar technician could recall exact coordinates, weather conditions, and timestamps years afterward because the encounter remained emotionally unfinished. Witnesses often described small details with remarkable clarity. The unusual silence surrounding the object, the abrupt directional movement, the overwhelming feeling that reality itself briefly stopped behaving normally. The encounter lasted only minutes. For some witnesses, the uncertainty lasted the rest of their lives. What makes many accounts emotionally compelling is how ordinary the witnesses appear. These are rarely dramatic personalities searching for attention. Many sound uncomfortable even while describing the events. Some hesitate mid-sentence. Others admit openly that they still do not know how to explain what they saw. That discomfort creates a strange form of credibility because certainty is largely absent from their voices. Instead, there is confusion. A retired military officer quietly describing an object hovering without sound over restricted airspace. A civilian recalling strange lights above a rural road before returning home uncertain whether to mention the experience at all. A radar specialist admitting decades later that certain recorded movements still make no sense despite years spent searching for technical explanations. The documentary carefully avoids presenting these individuals as believers or skeptics. Most occupy a far more uncertain psychological space. They witnessed something difficult to explain, yet often resisted extraordinary conclusions themselves. Some spent years researching atmospheric phenomena, military aircraft, and optical illusions, hoping to find ordinary answers that would finally settle the experience emotionally. Often, no explanation felt complete. That lingering incompleteness affected people in subtle ways. Witnesses described periods of obsession, followed by silence. Some avoided the subject entirely for years before speaking only after Pentagon disclosures reduced the social stigma surrounding unidentified aerial phenomena slightly. Others remained anonymous permanently, choosing privacy over attention because the emotional burden of the experience already felt heavy enough. Memory itself slowly becomes part of the mystery here. Human beings forget countless ordinary moments across their lives, yet these encounters often remained vivid long afterward, preserved with unusual emotional intensity. The audience begins sensing that the phenomenon may not only involve objects in the sky, it also leaves psychological traces inside the people who experience it. Something about the encounters disrupts normal perception deeply enough that memory refuses to release them completely. And perhaps that is why the mystery survives generation after generation. Not through dramatic revelations or definitive proof, but through individuals quietly carrying experiences they never fully resolved. Somewhere across the world, thousands of people may still remember strange lights, silent objects, impossible movements, or moments that briefly shattered their confidence in ordinary explanation. Most will never know exactly what they witnessed, yet the memory remains anyway. As the chapter closes, the emotional atmosphere becomes softer, almost melancholic. Humanity appears caught between skepticism and wonder, surrounded by experiences that feel deeply personal yet globally connected. And while witnesses struggled for decades to explain what they saw, another possibility quietly emerged alongside their stories. Perhaps modern technology itself had already begun recording evidence humanity was never fully prepared to interpret. Inside military control rooms, the world appears as light and movement across glowing screens. Radar sweeps rotate silently through darkness, while operators monitor oceans, coastlines, and restricted airspace with extraordinary precision. Modern surveillance systems were designed to remove uncertainty from the skies entirely. Satellites observed the planet continuously from orbit. Infrared cameras tracked heat signatures invisible to the human eye. Sonar arrays scanned beneath oceans, while radar networks mapped movement across enormous distances in real time. Technology was supposed to eliminate mystery, yet something unexpected happened as surveillance systems became more advanced. Instead of reducing unexplained aerial encounters, the systems occasionally detected anomalies that appeared even more difficult to explain than earlier sightings reported decades before. The mystery did not disappear beneath modern observation, In some ways, it intensified. Pentagon-related investigations revealed incidents where multiple independent systems tracked the same unknown object simultaneously. Radar operators detected targets moving at impossible speeds before stopping abruptly without visible deceleration. Infrared cameras captured heat signatures inconsistent with known aircraft behavior. Pilots visually confirmed movements already appearing on military screens moments earlier. The convergence created deep psychological tension because equipment malfunction alone no longer explained the encounters comfortably. One isolated radar error might be dismissed easily. Several systems confirming the same anomaly at the same moment became much harder to ignore. Operators described moments when unknown objects appeared suddenly within restricted airspace before accelerating beyond tracking range in seconds. In some cases, targets vanished from radar entirely, only to reappear elsewhere almost immediately. Certain movements confused tracking algorithms so severely that systems initially rejected the data as impossible. Machines designed to identify threats and filter ordinary aerial traffic struggled to categorize what they observed. That detail disturbed military analysts deeply. Because radar systems are not emotional, cameras do not experience fear, satellites do not exaggerate stories after stressful events. Human beings can misinterpret distance, speed, or atmospheric conditions under unusual circumstances. But when multiple technological systems independently register the same anomaly, uncertainty begins shifting into a different psychological category altogether. The more advanced the surveillance systems became, the less explainable certain objects appeared. Some encounters grew stranger during analysis itself. Infrared recordings showed objects lacking expected propulsion heat despite accelerating rapidly. Radar tracked movement patterns inconsistent with known aerodynamic limitations. Pilots visually observed objects performing maneuvers already recorded electronically before direct contact even occurred. The technology seemed to reinforce the mystery instead of dissolving it. Then investigators encountered another unsettling possibility. Certain objects appeared capable of interfering with the systems tracking them. Radar operators described targets flickering in and out of detection unpredictably. Electronic interference occasionally disrupted communications during encounters. Some objects vanished from surveillance entirely despite remaining visible briefly to pilots nearby. In a few cases, radar systems recorded movements so extreme that analysts initially assumed software failure because the data exceeded expected physical limitations. Yet the anomalies continued returning. The emotional atmosphere surrounding these incidents became increasingly tense, because military institutions depend heavily upon technological reliability. Modern defense systems operate on the assumption that surveillance networks accurately identify threats, monitor airspace, and detect abnormal movement consistently. If unknown objects repeatedly manipulated or bypassed those systems, the implications reach far beyond curiosity. The mystery evolved alongside technology itself. Human civilization entered the digital age believing machines would eventually provide objective answers to every unexplained phenomenon. Better sensors would produce clarity. Advanced tracking systems would eliminate ambiguity. But instead, modern surveillance occasionally revealed behavior that felt even more unsettling, precisely because it emerged from measurable data rather than folklore or rumor. Operators staring into glowing radar screens late at night sometimes encountered movement patterns they could not comfortably explain. Objects accelerated instantly. Targets changed direction without visible inertia. Unknown signals crossed monitored zones before disappearing entirely. Each incident existed briefly inside systems built specifically to prevent uncertainty from surviving. And still, uncertainty remained. That may have been the most disturbing development of all. The phenomenon no longer depended entirely on unreliable witnesses or blurry observations in distant skies. Modern technology itself had begun recording anomalies that resisted conventional explanation. Machines designed to clarify reality were occasionally producing evidence that made reality feel less stable instead. By the end of the section, viewers are left suspended between two deeply uncomfortable possibilities. Either advanced military systems repeatedly malfunctioned in extraordinarily specific ways across decades of observation, or they were accurately detecting something operating beyond ordinary human understanding. And as the anomalies continued appearing within radar systems and infrared recordings, another question slowly emerged from the darkness surrounding them. What if the phenomenon was not merely being observed by human technology, but was somehow aware of the observation itself? At first, Investigators approached the phenomenon as a technological problem. Unknown objects entered restricted airspace. Radar systems detected unusual movement. Pilots reported impossible acceleration and unexplained maneuvers. The assumption remained relatively simple, even if unsettling. Somewhere, something advanced existed. The task was merely identifying what it was and where it came from. But over time, another possibility emerged quietly from the reports themselves. Some objects did not merely move strangely. They appeared to react. Military pilots occasionally described encounters where unidentified craft mirrored their maneuvers with eerie precision. An aircraft would change direction, descend, or accelerate, and the object responded instantly as though anticipating the movement before it happened. Radar operators noticed targets altering course immediately after detection attempts began. In several reports, unknown objects accelerated away at precisely calculated moments, disappearing seconds before interception aircraft arrived at predicted locations. That detail changed the emotional atmosphere completely. Random atmospheric phenomena do not evade pursuit intentionally. Equipment malfunctions do not respond intelligently to observation. Yet certain incidents describe behavior that felt purposeful in ways investigators struggle to explain comfortably. The documentary avoids dramatic conclusions here, because the restraint itself creates deeper unease. Nothing is stated directly. Instead, the audience slowly confronts the implications independently through repeated patterns emerging across military testimony. What frightened some investigators most was not the movement of the objects, but the possibility that the objects were reacting consciously. One naval pilot described an encounter where a smooth white craft appeared to circle around his aircraft before suddenly matching altitude changes with impossible precision. Another report detailed an object hovering motionless above military exercises before accelerating away the moment fighter jets approached aggressively. Radar specialists later admitted some movement patterns resembled calculated responses rather than random flight behavior. The possibility itself became psychologically disturbing. Unknown technology is one thing. Unknown intelligence is something entirely different. Because intelligence implies awareness. It implies observation, decision-making, intent. The mystery no longer felt limited to unexplained objects crossing the sky. It began touching something far deeper and more existential. If the phenomenon displayed signs of adaptive behavior, then humanity might not simply be observing anomalies. Humanity might itself be part of the observation. That realization altered the emotional tone inside certain investigations dramatically. Military analysts are trained to study behavior patterns carefully. Threat assessment depends upon recognizing intention behind movement. A missile follows predictable physics. Atmospheric conditions behave according to natural systems. But some reports described objects making choices. They accelerated at strategically effective moments. They positioned themselves near training exercises without engaging directly. They hovered silently as though observing operations below before vanishing once attention focused upon them intensely. The behavior felt deliberate without becoming openly hostile, and that ambiguity made the encounters even more unsettling. If the objects attacked consistently, military institutions could categorize them as threats. If they behaved randomly, they could potentially be dismissed as anomalies or misunderstood phenomena. Instead, the reports often occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, where the objects appeared aware without revealing purpose clearly enough to define. Some investigators privately questioned whether the phenomenon remained elusive intentionally. Not hidden completely, just beyond full comprehension. The documentary raises this possibility carefully, almost quietly, because certainty never existed inside the records themselves. Yet once introduced, the idea becomes difficult to ignore emotionally. Human beings spent decades attempting to identify these objects through radar systems, infrared tracking, satellites, and military pursuit. But what if the phenomenon itself had always been aware of those attempts? The skies suddenly feel less empty after that thought enters the narrative. Pilots described moments where objects accelerated away before weapon systems locked onto them fully. Radar operators watched targets disappear from monitored zones seconds before interception paths converged. Military personnel repeatedly encountered behavior that seemed strangely responsive to human observation itself. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the encounters rarely produced clear communication or direct confrontation. The phenomenon remained present enough to provoke fascination, yet distant enough to preserve uncertainty permanently. That balance created the eerie impression of something observing humanity carefully, while refusing complete visibility. By the end of the section, the mystery no longer resembles random, unidentified aircraft crossing military airspace accidentally. Instead, something appears to move through restricted skies with awareness difficult to categorize and impossible to confirm completely. The emotional effect becomes deeply psychological, because once intelligence enters the mystery, every encounter changes meaning. The unknown no longer feels passive. It feels potentially conscious, and somewhere inside glowing radar screens, classified archives, and silent night skies above military operations, investigators began confronting another difficult question. If modern surveillance systems covered enormous portions of Earth continuously, why did the phenomenon remain so elusive despite being observed repeatedly for decades? Modern civilization was built upon a quiet assumption that uncertainty would eventually disappear. Every generation believed improved technology would illuminate what earlier societies misunderstood. Telescopes revealed distant galaxies. Microscopes uncovered invisible life. Satellites transformed entire planets into observable systems mapped continuously from orbit. Human beings entered the digital age convinced that information itself would gradually erase mystery from the world. Yet the phenomenon survived every attempt to fully capture it. That contradiction sits quietly at the center of the Pentagon UFO Files. Decades passed, surveillance systems evolved, radar became more precise. Infrared cameras detected heat invisible to the human eye. Artificial intelligence began analyzing movement patterns faster than human operators ever could. And still, the mystery remained incomplete in strangely familiar ways. Every breakthrough generated new contradictions. Better cameras occasionally produced blurry footage under conditions where clarity should have existed. Radar systems tracked impossible accelerations, while visual confirmation remained frustratingly limited. Witnesses described remarkably consistent behavior patterns across decades, yet rarely enough detail to eliminate uncertainty entirely. Information accumulated endlessly without transforming into definitive understanding. The deeper investigators looked, the stranger the structure of the mystery became. Ordinary objects eventually reveal themselves under sufficient observation. Aircraft can be identified through shape, propulsion, heat signatures, or flight behavior. Atmospheric phenomena follow recognizable environmental conditions. Human error produces patterns investigators learn to isolate over time. But unidentified aerial phenomena often appeared at the edge of clarity itself, revealing fragments without ever allowing complete understanding comfortably to settle into place. That detail created a haunting emotional effect. The phenomenon did not behave like a stable object waiting patiently to be examined. Instead, it appeared intermittently, unpredictably, and often under circumstances where observation remained incomplete. A radar track without clear visuals, infrared footage without identifiable structure, a pilot encounter lasting seconds before disappearance. Each incident resembled a fragment separated from something larger humanity could sense but never fully observe. The audience slowly begins realizing the mystery may not simply involve unidentified craft hidden somewhere in the sky. It may involve the limits of observation itself. This possibility becomes deeply philosophical as the chapter moves toward its conclusion. Human beings prefer believing reality is fundamentally understandable. Modern civilization depends upon measurement, classification, and explanation. Technology reinforces the comforting idea that anything unknown today will eventually become known tomorrow through enough data and analysis. But what if certain phenomena exist partially outside the systems humans rely upon to interpret reality? That question lingers quietly beneath the documentary without demanding a direct answer. The narration never claims the phenomenon is supernatural, extraterrestrial, or beyond science entirely. Instead, it suggests something more psychologically unsettling. Perhaps human perception itself has boundaries. Civilization rarely acknowledges openly. Every species experiences reality through limited senses. Human beings cannot naturally detect ultraviolet light, electromagnetic fields, or vast portions of the electromagnetic spectrum without technological assistance. Entire layers of existence remain invisible until tools reveal them indirectly. The documentary carefully raises the possibility that unidentified phenomena may occupy a similar conceptual space, appearing only in fragments because humanity lacks complete frameworks for understanding them fully. That would explain the strange incompleteness surrounding the encounters. not because evidence is absent, but because observation itself remains partial. Radar systems detect movement, while cameras fail to capture detail clearly. Witnesses observe impossible behavior while struggling to interpret what they saw. Advanced sensors confirm anomalies without resolving their nature completely. The phenomenon survives not through lack of data, but through an overwhelming accumulation of incomplete data refusing to form stable conclusions. And slowly the emotional atmosphere changes once again. The greatest discomfort may not come from the possibility of extraterrestrial life or hidden technology. It may come from realizing that human beings, despite centuries of scientific advancement, still confront mysteries capable of resisting full comprehension. Modern humanity can monitor continents from orbit, track missiles across oceans, and analyze microscopic particles invisible to the naked eye. Yet something continues appearing within monitored skies that remains unresolved. As radar screens fade quietly into darkness and distant military control rooms return to silence, the audience is left suspended between fascination and unease. The mystery survived improved surveillance, classified investigations, and decades of analysis without disappearing. And once conventional explanations begin collapsing under their own contradictions, another question emerges naturally from the silence surrounding the phenomenon. If these encounters are real in some form, what possibilities remain once ordinary understanding is no longer enough to contain them? The deeper the phenomenon moved into official investigations, the more carefully certain possibilities were avoided. Governments could discuss radar anomalies, scientists could debate atmospheric conditions, military officials could acknowledge unidentified objects entering restricted airspace cautiously, without creating immediate panic. But one idea remained emotionally difficult even to approach directly. What if some encounters involved intelligence? Not necessarily extraterrestrial intelligence in the dramatic sense popular culture imagined, but something displaying awareness beyond random physical behavior. The documentary moves carefully through this territory because the discomfort surrounding the subject has never depended entirely on aliens or science fiction. In many ways, the fear emerged from something more profound and psychologically destabilizing. The possibility itself was not what frightened institutions most. It was the collapse of certainty. For decades, investigators attempted fitting unidentified aerial encounters into familiar categories. Experimental aircraft explained some sightings, equipment malfunction explained others. Atmospheric phenomena accounted for unusual lights under rare conditions. Intelligence agencies searched constantly for evidence of foreign technology. Every explanation, even incomplete ones, preserved a basic assumption that the world remained understandable and ultimately controllable. But certain cases resisted those categories repeatedly. Objects accelerated beyond expected engineering limits. Encounters repeated across generations and geopolitical borders. Witnesses described behavior suggesting awareness rather than random movement. And perhaps most unsettling of all, no single explanation eliminated the contradictions entirely. Each attempt to resolve the mystery left fragments behind that refused to fit comfortably inside ordinary understanding. That uncertainty produced quiet institutional anxiety. Scientists feared professional ridicule associated with openly studying unexplained phenomena. Intelligence agencies worried that admitting uncertainty publicly could weaken confidence in military control. Political leaders avoided discussions that sounded irrational or speculative. As a result, the most psychologically disturbing possibilities often remained hidden beneath cautious language and fragmented investigations instead of being confronted directly. The audience slowly realizes something important here. The fear surrounding the phenomenon may never have centered entirely on extraterrestrials. It centered on unpredictability. Modern civilization depends upon the belief that reality becomes increasingly knowable over time. Human beings map oceans, decode genetics, monitor planets from orbit, and analyze invisible particles through advanced instruments. Every century strengthens the expectation that mystery itself gradually retreats beneath science and technology. Unidentified aerial phenomena challenge that expectation in deeply uncomfortable ways because they continue surviving despite modern observation systems designed specifically to eliminate uncertainty. The narration becomes quieter and more reflective as it explores how humanity historically responded to unexplained phenomena across different eras. Ancient civilizations described divine messengers descending from the heavens. Medieval societies interpreted strange lights as omens or spiritual signs. Modern cultures frame similar experiences through technology, aerospace, language, and intelligence terminology instead. That pattern raises a haunting possibility. Perhaps humanity always translates the unknown into the language it understands most comfortably. In ancient times, unexplained phenomena became mythology, because mythology provided the strongest available framework for interpreting mystery. In the modern world, unexplained phenomena become advanced technology because technological civilization views reality primarily through systems, machines, and scientific concepts. The core experience may remain emotionally similar across history, even while the explanations surrounding it evolve dramatically. That idea creates profound psychological tension. Because if human beings interpret the unknown according to cultural expectations rather than objective understanding entirely, then certainty itself becomes fragile. The audience begins questioning where skepticism ends and denial begins. Caution remains reasonable. Extraordinary claims require evidence. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates that human understanding expands beyond previous assumptions over time. The documentary never demands belief. Instead, it invites viewers into uncertainty itself. Perhaps the phenomenon represents misunderstood natural processes, perhaps advanced classified technology, perhaps psychological projection shaped by expectation and fear, or perhaps humanity occasionally encounters forms of intelligence or reality, still lacking clear conceptual frameworks entirely. None of the possibilities feel emotionally comfortable because each one forces civilization to confront limitations somewhere inside its understanding of the world. And that may explain why the subject remained trapped between ridicule and secrecy for so long. Not because governments possessed complete answers hidden from the public, but because uncertainty itself became difficult to manage psychologically. Institutions built upon authority prefer stable explanations. Human beings prefer predictable reality. Yet the phenomenon continued appearing generation after generation in ways that resisted closure completely. By the end of the section, the audience feels suspended between rational skepticism and expanding uncertainty, unable to determine exactly where caution transforms into avoidance. And once the fear of uncertainty itself enters the narrative, another question slowly begins emerging from history's shadows. If humanity has struggled to explain these encounters in the modern age, could similar phenomena have appeared long before radar, aircraft, or contemporary civilization ever existed? The story begins drifting away from radar screens and classified briefings now, moving backward through centuries until modern language itself starts dissolving. Military archives fade into older records written beneath candlelight, carved into stone, painted across temple walls, or carried through generations as oral tradition. The mystery does not disappear there. In some ways, it becomes stranger, because long before aircraft crossed the sky, human beings were already describing things they could not explain. Ancient texts from different civilizations contain references to luminous objects descending from the heavens, strange lights moving silently across the night, and beings associated with knowledge, warning, or transformation. The documentary approaches these accounts carefully, resisting the temptation to force modern conclusions onto ancient stories. Interpretation matters here more than certainty. The goal is not proving ancient astronauts or hidden civilizations. It is observing patterns quietly repeating across time. A medieval painting depicting unusual shapes suspended in the sky. A Roman historian describing glowing shields moving above battlefields. Indigenous oral traditions, speaking of star beings, arriving from beyond the mountains or oceans. Ancient Sanskrit writings, referring to aerial vehicles moving through clouds with impossible speed. None of these accounts confirm modern UFO narratives directly, yet taken together, they create a strange emotional continuity, difficult to ignore completely. The audience slowly begins noticing something deeper than visual similarities. The emotional reactions remain remarkably familiar. Awe, confusion, fear mixed with fascination, silence afterward. Witnesses throughout history repeatedly describe confronting something beyond ordinary explanation, then struggling to translate the experience into language their cultures could understand. Ancient societies described gods, spirits, or celestial messengers, because those frameworks felt emotionally and intellectually available. Modern societies describe technology, intelligence, aerospace systems, and anomalous phenomena for the same reason. Perhaps humanity always explains the unknown through the vocabulary of its own era. That possibility changes the atmosphere of the documentary entirely. The mystery no longer feels confined to modern military encounters or classified Pentagon investigations. Instead, it begins resembling a shadow, stretching quietly through human history itself, appearing differently across civilizations, while preserving certain emotional characteristics beneath the changing language. The narration remains deliberately cautious here, because certainty would weaken the emotional effect. The documentary never claims ancient people witnessed spacecraft in the modern sense. Many historical stories may represent symbolism, mythology, misunderstood natural phenomena, or spiritual interpretation shaped by cultural belief systems. Yet some accounts continue feeling strangely difficult to dismiss entirely because they resemble modern descriptions in unexpected ways. Objects descending silently from the sky, lights hovering motionless before disappearing suddenly. Witnesses overwhelmed by the feeling that reality briefly stopped behaving normally. The similarities become more haunting precisely because they emerge gradually, rather than through dramatic declaration. Ancient skies blend slowly into modern footage of radar screens and military recordings. A glowing object painted centuries ago dissolves into infrared imagery captured by fighter pilots above dark oceans. Human beings separated by enormous distances in time appear connected through the same unresolved experience of encountering something they cannot fully explain. That continuity creates a dreamlike emotional effect. What if the phenomenon did not begin with modern aircraft, but has followed humanity far longer than recorded history admits? The question lingers without demanding belief. Instead, it invites reflection. Civilizations rise and disappear. Technologies evolve. Languages change. Yet perhaps certain mysteries survive across every era because they exist partly outside the frameworks human beings use to define reality comfortably. And maybe that is why the phenomenon remains so difficult to categorize today. Modern governments approach the mystery through intelligence analysis and surveillance technology. Ancient civilizations approach similar experiences through myth, religion, and symbolism. Both may simply represent different attempts to interpret encounters that resist complete understanding within the limits of a single worldview. The documentary becomes quieter now, almost timeless. Ancient constellations drift across the screen, while distant radar signals echo faintly beneath the narration. Human history itself begins feeling smaller against the scale of the unknown. The audience no longer sees modern UFO reports as isolated anomalies disconnected from the past. Instead, the encounters appear woven into a much older pattern humanity has been trying to describe for centuries without ever fully resolving. Still, no final answer emerges. Only another layer of uncertainty stretching deeper into history than governments, scientists, or skeptics comfortably expected. And as the mystery expands beyond modern civilization entirely, another question slowly forms from the silence surrounding it. If humanity has repeatedly encountered phenomena it cannot fully explain across centuries of history, what does that reveal about humanity itself? By the time the investigation reaches this point, the mystery no longer feels limited to unidentified objects moving through restricted airspace. Something larger has emerged slowly beneath the Pentagon files: military testimony, ancient accounts, and decades of unresolved encounters. The phenomenon has begun exposing a quieter and far more uncomfortable possibility. Human understanding itself may have limits civilization rarely acknowledges openly. For centuries, modern society moved forward with extraordinary confidence in science, technology, and observation. Every generation believed uncertainty would gradually shrink beneath expanding knowledge. Diseases once considered supernatural became understood biologically. Lightning transformed from divine punishment into measurable electrical force. Space itself evolved from distant mythology into mapped physical reality explored through satellites and telescopes. Humanity learned to believe that every mystery eventually becomes ordinary once enough information is collected. Yet despite advanced surveillance systems, artificial intelligence, global communication networks, and decades of military investigation, certain phenomena continue resisting explanation in strangely persistent ways. The contradiction feels psychologically unsettling, because modern civilization depends deeply upon the assumption that reality is fundamentally understandable. The Pentagon files quietly challenge that assumption. Radar systems detect impossible movement patterns. Witnesses describe recurring behavior across generations. Governments investigate incidents seriously while avoiding definitive conclusions publicly. Scientists analyze data without eliminating uncertainty completely. Each layer of observation produces fragments of understanding without delivering stable resolution. The mystery survives not because humanity lacks intelligence, but perhaps because some questions do not behave like ordinary problems, waiting patiently for solutions. The narration becomes slower here, almost reflective, allowing the emotional weight of that idea to settle gradually. Maybe the phenomenon exists permanently near the boundary between observation and comprehension. Human beings catch glimpses of it through radar tracks, historical records, witness testimony, and fleeting encounters, yet never clearly enough to grasp the full structure behind what they observe. That possibility changes the meaning of the mystery entirely. The unknown becomes less like a hidden object waiting to be discovered, and more like a mirror reflecting the limitations of human perception itself. Every attempt to explain the phenomenon reveals something not only about the objects, but about the frameworks humanity uses to interpret reality. Science searches for measurable patterns. Governments search for strategic threats. Religion searches for meaning. Psychology searches for cognitive explanation. Yet none fully contain the phenomenon comfortably within their boundaries. And perhaps that is why the mystery feels emotionally powerful across generations. Because uncertainty itself unsettles human beings deeply. The documentary carefully refuses false closure here. Every major possibility remains open intentionally. Perhaps the encounters involve classified technology hidden beyond public awareness. Perhaps misunderstood physics occasionally produces effects civilization still struggles to recognize. Perhaps unknown intelligence exists beyond humanity in forms difficult to conceptualize. Or perhaps the phenomenon occupies a category entirely outside current language and understanding. None of those explanations feel completely satisfying, but neither does dismissing the phenomenon entirely anymore. The audience is left suspended between skepticism and wonder, unable to settle comfortably into certainty on either side. That tension becomes the emotional center of the chapter. The mystery does not demand belief. It demands humility. Human history repeatedly demonstrates that reality expands beyond previous assumptions. Entire dimensions of existence once remained invisible until tools and understanding evolved enough to reveal them. The documentary quietly suggests that unidentified phenomena may force humanity into a similar confrontation with intellectual limitation once again. And perhaps the greatest mystery was never what humanity saw in the sky, but how humanity reacts when it encounters something it cannot fully explain. The final moments become almost hypnotic in their stillness. Earth drifts silently through darkness, viewed from orbit, illuminated by scattered city lights beneath moving clouds. Oceans reflect moonlight. Satellites circle invisibly above sleeping populations, unaware of the unanswered questions, continuing quietly through military archives and radar systems below. Against the scale of existence itself, human certainty suddenly appears fragile. Civilizations rise, believing they understand reality, only to discover larger structures waiting beyond current perception. The Pentagon Files may ultimately matter not because they prove extraterrestrial life or hidden technology conclusively, but because they reveal how incomplete humanity's understanding of the world may still be. And somewhere beneath the stars, inside glowing control rooms and classified monitoring stations, radar systems continue searching the skies without fully knowing what they might eventually find. As the chapter closes, another possibility begins emerging from the silence surrounding the phenomenon. What happens if secrecy itself can no longer contain the mystery much longer? For most of modern history, the subject survived in shadows. Unidentified aerial phenomena existed somewhere between rumor and ridicule, discussed quietly by witnesses, researchers, and military personnel while mainstream institutions kept careful distance. Governments denied serious interest publicly, even as investigations continued privately behind classified walls. The pattern repeated for decades, with almost mechanical consistency. Strange reports surfaced briefly, public curiosity intensified, officials dismissed the topic cautiously, and silence eventually returned. Then something began changing, not suddenly, not through one dramatic announcement or world-altering revelation. The shift emerged slowly, almost reluctantly, through fragments accumulating faster than institutions could contain them comfortably. A leaked military video appeared online showing an object moving in ways pilots struggled to explain. Former intelligence officials publicly confirmed the footage was authentic. Journalists with established reputations began investigating military encounters seriously instead of treating them as entertainment. Congressional discussions quietly entered public view. The world did not wake up one morning to full disclosure. It happened quietly, piece by piece, until denial itself became difficult to maintain. At first, many people barely noticed. The footage itself looked strangely ordinary. Grainy infrared recordings captured objects moving across military targeting systems without offering clear visual detail. Yet the emotional impact came not from cinematic evidence, but from the reaction surrounding it. Navy pilots confirmed the encounters publicly. Defense officials acknowledged active investigations. Former intelligence personnel described years of classified analysis involving unidentified aerial phenomena, without sounding theatrical or sensational. That restraint changed everything. The topic no longer belonged entirely to conspiracy culture or fringe speculation. It entered mainstream discussion through credible institutions and measured language. News anchors who once laughed openly at UFO stories began discussing military encounters calmly during primetime broadcasts. Skeptics reconsidered assumptions. Former officials stepped forward, describing investigations previously hidden behind security classifications. Slowly, the emotional atmosphere surrounding the phenomenon shifted from ridicule toward uncertainty. But even then, the process remained fragmented. Disclosure did not unfold through complete transparency. Information arrived unevenly through leaks, interviews, hearings, and partial confirmations. Certain officials acknowledged the reality of unexplained encounters while avoiding conclusions about origin or intent. Congressional committees requested classified briefings. Investigative journalists uncovered evidence suggesting military programs examining unidentified phenomena had continued quietly for years despite public denial. The deeper the story entered public awareness, the stranger the structure surrounding it became. Some officials appeared deeply uncomfortable with the growing openness. Others encouraged further investigation cautiously. The audience begins sensing an important emotional truth here. Disclosure may never have been a coordinated decision fully controlled by governments at all. Instead, secrecy itself may simply have become harder to maintain inside a world transformed by digital communication, satellite imagery, whistleblowers, and constant public scrutiny. That realization changes the meaning of disclosure completely. The phenomenon did not emerge because institutions suddenly wanted transparency. It emerged because the walls surrounding the topic began weakening from multiple directions simultaneously. Pilots recorded encounters digitally. Leaked footage spread globally within hours online. Journalists bypassed traditional gatekeeping structures. Former insiders spoke publicly after retirement or frustration with institutional silence. The information ecosystem itself evolved faster than older secrecy systems could adapt comfortably. And still, no final answers appeared. That contradiction created deep psychological tension within public conversation. The world received increasing confirmation that military personnel encountered unexplained phenomena seriously, yet certainty remained absent. Officials acknowledged investigations without explaining conclusions fully. Footage circulated widely without resolving what exactly it showed. The mystery became publicly legitimate while remaining fundamentally unresolved. Perhaps that was the strangest development of all. What once sounded absurd slowly became normalized through repetition. Terms like unidentified aerial phenomena entered mainstream language. Congressional hearings discussed incursions into military airspace openly. Former skeptics admitted certain cases resisted ordinary explanation. Yet despite increasing openness, the phenomenon itself remained just beyond complete understanding, preserving uncertainty even as secrecy weakened around it. The audience begins feeling suspended inside a strange historical transition. Humanity may be witnessing the gradual collapse of one of modern history's longest-standing walls of institutional silence without fully understanding what lies behind it. Governments appear less capable of controlling the narrative completely, yet still unwilling or unable to provide definitive explanations. The result feels less like planned disclosure and more like controlled uncertainty slowly escaping into public awareness. And as the pressure surrounding the phenomenon intensified publicly, another question emerged naturally behind closed political and intelligence circles. What exactly did lawmakers and classified investigators discover once they finally demanded direct access to information hidden inside the system itself? Behind the public hearings and carefully worded press statements, another conversation unfolded quietly inside secure rooms in Washington. Members of Congress, intelligence representatives, military officials, and defense analysts gathered behind closed doors to discuss incidents involving unidentified aerial phenomena with a level of seriousness rarely seen publicly before. The atmosphere surrounding those meetings felt different from ordinary political debate. The topic no longer carried the tone of speculation or entertainment. It carried the weight of unresolved national security concern. And perhaps most unsettling of all, even powerful officials appeared uncertain about what they were confronting. The most powerful people in government entered the briefings expecting answers. Many reportedly left with more questions. That emotional detail became impossible to ignore once lawmakers began speaking publicly afterward. Some emerged visibly unsettled, acknowledging that the phenomenon deserved serious investigation. Others expressed frustration regarding fragmented intelligence systems, where information appeared compartmentalized across agencies in ways difficult even for elected oversight committees to access completely. The audience slowly begins realizing something deeply uncomfortable. The secrecy surrounding the phenomenon may extend beyond ordinary political control. For decades, many people assumed governments hid definitive answers regarding unidentified aerial encounters. But inside the congressional briefings, a different picture began emerging. Officials repeatedly described advanced objects entering restricted military airspace while simultaneously admitting they lacked clear explanations regarding origin, technology, or intent. The mystery appeared not fully solved behind closed doors, but partially fragmented inside institutions themselves. That distinction changes the emotional atmosphere dramatically. Some lawmakers hinted publicly that information remained buried inside highly classified programs, inaccessible even through traditional oversight channels. Others described resistance from agencies reluctant to share intelligence openly. The issue no longer resembled a single hidden conspiracy controlled neatly from above. Instead, it felt more chaotic, compartmentalized, and uncertain than the public previously imagined. The documentary avoids dramatic accusations intentionally here because realism itself creates stronger tension. Government institutions often function imperfectly, even under ordinary circumstances. Intelligence systems divide information across departments. Military programs operate under varying classification structures. National security investigations frequently remain fragmented for strategic reasons. Yet when lawmakers themselves struggled obtaining coherent answers regarding unidentified phenomena, the audience begins sensing that institutional confusion may exist alongside secrecy simultaneously. Officials described encounters involving extraordinary movement patterns, restricted military airspace incursions, and objects displaying capabilities beyond conventional aircraft understanding. Yet despite years of investigation, definitive conclusions remained absent from many discussions. The audience starts understanding that disclosure may not lead towards certainty at all. Instead, it may simply reveal how much uncertainty already exists within the highest levels of government. That realization becomes deeply psychological. The issue gradually shifted from public ridicule towards strategic concern. Politicians and defense officials stopped asking whether UFOs were real in the simplistic cultural sense. A different question replaced it quietly inside Washington. Why were unknown objects repeatedly entering sensitive military environments without reliable identification? That framing changed everything. National security discussions operate differently from entertainment or speculation. Military institutions cannot simply ignore recurring anomalies inside restricted airspace, because uncertainty itself creates vulnerability. Whether the phenomenon represented advanced foreign technology, misunderstood natural processes, intelligence failures, or something stranger entirely, the inability to explain repeated incursions became increasingly difficult to dismiss publicly. Some lawmakers described feeling disturbed less by the existence of unexplained encounters and more by the apparent absence of clear institutional coordination surrounding them. Information appeared scattered. Certain programs remained classified aggressively. Witness testimony accumulated without producing stable conclusions. The deeper officials looked into the phenomenon, the more complicated the structure around it seemed to become. And still, the briefings continued. Inside secure facilities, analysts reviewed radar data, infrared recordings, pilot testimony, and intelligence assessments, while elected representatives demanded greater transparency regarding what exactly military agencies had encountered over decades. Yet, even after gaining access to classified information, many officials continued speaking cautiously afterward, emphasizing investigation rather than explanation. That caution itself became emotionally revealing, because certainty produces confidence. Uncertainty produces careful language. By the end of the section, the audience feels suspended inside a strange political reality where governments appear simultaneously more informed and less certain than the public once imagined. Somewhere inside classified briefings, military archives, and intelligence reports, officials may already know far more than ordinary citizens realize. Yet perhaps far less than people hope, the mystery remains unresolved even at the highest levels of power, and that realization creates a haunting emotional effect. If lawmakers, intelligence officials, and defense analysts still struggle to explain what certain encounters represent, then the phenomenon may exist beyond ordinary systems of institutional control entirely. And as political pressure surrounding disclosure intensified, another layer of the story slowly emerged from the shadows. The individuals who risked careers, reputations, and silence itself by deciding to speak publicly anyway. For years, the phenomenon survived largely through fragments. Radar tracks buried inside classified systems, pilot testimony hidden within military reports, intelligence briefings discussed quietly behind secure doors. But eventually, something changed within the people closest to the mystery itself. Individuals who spent careers inside military and intelligence environments slowly began stepping forward publicly despite the personal risks surrounding the subject. And many of them did not look like people searching for attention. That detail matters deeply. The documentary slows here, becoming more intimate and emotionally grounded as viewers meet pilots, analysts, defense officials, and former insiders who described witnessing events they could never comfortably explain away. Most speak cautiously. Some appear visibly conflicted. Others choose their words with extraordinary precision, as though fully aware that every sentence may permanently alter how colleagues and institutions view them afterward. Their restraint becomes emotionally powerful because it feels genuine. These are not dramatic personalities delivering sensational speeches. Many sound uncomfortable discussing the encounters at all. They rarely claim certainty regarding extraterrestrials or hidden cosmic truths. Instead, they return repeatedly to one simple point. Something unexplained happened, and it deserves honest investigation. Some witnesses stayed silent for decades. The question is not why they finally spoke, but what made silence impossible to continue. That question slowly becomes the emotional center of the section. Former military personnel described years of frustration, watching serious encounters dismissed publicly despite classified concern behind closed doors. Intelligence officials hinted at compartmentalized programs where information remained fragmented and inaccessible even internally. Pilots explained how ridicule surrounding unidentified aerial phenomena discouraged open discussion within aviation culture for years, creating an environment where witnesses often avoided reporting incidents entirely. The audience begins understanding how powerful social pressure surrounding the phenomenon once was. Speaking openly about unexplained encounters carried consequences long before public attitudes softened recently. Careers could stall, professional credibility could disappear, colleagues might quietly distance themselves. In highly technical fields built upon trust and precision, association with the UFO subject often created immediate suspicion regardless of the witness's background or expertise. That psychological burden shaped silence for generations. Some witnesses reportedly spent years trying to rationalize what they saw privately before speaking publicly at all. Others refused interviews repeatedly until official Pentagon acknowledgements reduced the stigma enough that discussing the encounters no longer felt professionally catastrophic. Even then, many continued sounding hesitant rather than confident. That hesitation creates strange credibility, because certainty often feels rehearsed. Uncertainty feels human. A former pilot pauses before describing an object accelerating beyond conventional understanding. An intelligence analyst carefully explains that certain incidents resisted explanation despite extensive investigation. A defense official admits frustration with secrecy surrounding programs examining unidentified phenomena without claiming possession of definitive answers. Their emotional tone remains measured, restrained, sometimes almost reluctant, and that restraint makes the mystery heavier somehow. The documentary carefully avoids transforming these individuals into heroic figures or flawless truth-tellers. Instead, they appear deeply human, Some express confusion. Others admit fear regarding professional consequences. A few describe isolation after deciding to speak publicly. The emotional realism surrounding their experiences prevents the phenomenon from drifting into abstract speculation entirely, because behind every public statement exists personal cost, friendships strained, careers altered, reputations questioned. Some witnesses reportedly lost opportunities or professional standing after becoming associated publicly with the subject. Others withdrew from media attention completely after realizing how emotionally exhausting public scrutiny could become. Disclosure itself carried consequences few outsiders fully understood. Yet despite those consequences, more individuals continued speaking. That detail lingers quietly beneath the narrative. What convinces experienced military personnel, intelligence officials, and defense analysts to risk credibility merely to insist that unexplained phenomena deserve serious attention? The documentary never answers directly. Instead, it allows the audience to sit inside the discomfort surrounding the question itself. Perhaps the witnesses spoke because they believed the public deserved honesty regarding unresolved encounters occurring inside restricted military environments. Or perhaps something about the phenomenon itself leaves people emotionally unable to remain silent forever. By the end of the section, the emotional atmosphere becomes quieter, almost melancholic. Disclosure no longer feels like abstract political process alone. It feels deeply personal, carried forward by individuals willing to endure uncertainty, skepticism, and professional risk, simply to say the mystery should not be ignored anymore. And as more witnesses stepped forward publicly, another shift began unfolding beyond government secrecy and intelligence culture entirely. Science itself slowly started confronting phenomena that refused easy explanation. For most of the modern era, serious scientists avoided the UFO subject almost instinctively. The risk extended far beyond disagreement or skepticism. Careers in physics, astronomy, aerospace engineering, and academic research depended heavily upon credibility, peer review, and institutional trust. Associating publicly with unidentified aerial phenomena often carried the danger of reputational damage difficult to reverse. As a result, many researchers quietly ignored the topic entirely, regardless of personal curiosity. But eventually, the atmosphere surrounding the phenomenon began changing. Pentagon disclosures accumulated. Military footage entered public discussion. Trained pilots described encounters openly. Radar data confirmed anomalies, difficult to dismiss casually. And slowly, some scientists started approaching the subject from a different angle entirely. Not as proof of extraterrestrials, as an unresolved observational problem. That distinction became deeply important. The greatest shift was not that governments admitted uncertainty, but that science slowly began admitting it too. The documentary moves carefully through this transition because the emotional power comes from restraint rather than dramatic claims. Physicists, astronomers, data analysts, and aerospace experts did not suddenly declare the existence of alien civilizations. Instead, they acknowledged something quieter and more intellectually unsettling. Certain reported encounters appeared worthy of investigation precisely because ordinary explanations did not fully resolve the available evidence. Scientific teams began reviewing military footage frame by frame. Analysts studied radar tracks and infrared recordings. Aerospace engineers examined reported flight characteristics while comparing them against known propulsion systems and aerodynamic limitations. The deeper the analysis became, the more complicated the mystery appeared. Some reported maneuvers challenged basic engineering assumptions. Objects accelerated rapidly without visible propulsion. Certain encounters described abrupt directional changes that should generate extreme inertia forces beyond known aircraft survivability. Infrared systems occasionally detected movement without expected heat signatures. Radar data recorded patterns inconsistent with conventional flight behavior. The documentary carefully avoids claiming impossible technology already exists publicly. Instead, it focuses on the tension emerging when reported observations refuse to align comfortably with current understanding. That tension becomes emotionally powerful because the scientists themselves often remain cautious. A physicist admits certain movement patterns appear difficult to explain conventionally, while emphasizing incomplete data. An aerospace engineer discusses theoretical propulsion concepts without claiming practical implementation exists. Astronomers acknowledge the statistical possibility of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, while remaining skeptical regarding definitive conclusions about Earth encounters specifically. The audience begins noticing something subtle but important. Serious scientific interest does not automatically produce clarity. In some ways, deeper analysis intensified the mystery instead of reducing it. Simpler explanations gradually weakened under more sophisticated scrutiny. Sensor malfunction alone failed to account for multiple systems confirming the same anomaly simultaneously. Misidentification became harder to sustain in cases involving trained military observers and corroborating radar data. The unknown survived increasingly advanced examination. That realization changed the emotional atmosphere surrounding the phenomenon profoundly. Science no longer appeared, positioned safely outside the mystery, analyzing it from a comfortable distance. Instead, science itself seemed drawn slowly into uncertainty. Researchers confronted the possibility that certain encounters exposed gaps not only in available evidence, but perhaps in existing conceptual frameworks as well. And that possibility carried professional risk. Some scientists worried publicly. Engaging with the topic could damage funding opportunities, academic standing, or institutional credibility. Colleagues sometimes viewed the subject as inherently contaminated by conspiracy culture and sensationalism, regardless of available data. The emotional tension surrounding the field extended beyond evidence itself into questions of reputation and intellectual legitimacy. Yet others argued something equally compelling. Ignoring unexplained data because it feels uncomfortable violates the spirit of scientific inquiry entirely. That idea becomes the philosophical center of the section. Science advances precisely by investigating anomalies resisting current understanding. Throughout history, unexplained observations often reveal deeper structures of reality once technology and theory evolved enough to interpret them correctly. The documentary carefully suggests that unidentified phenomena may occupy a similar space of unresolved observation rather than immediate belief or dismissal. Still, no final conclusions emerge. The phenomenon remains frustratingly incomplete, even under scientific examination. Data exists without resolution. Observations accumulate without stable interpretation. Every analytical breakthrough seems to reveal new layers of contradiction beneath the surface. And slowly, the audience begins sensing another uncomfortable possibility. If trained scientists analyzing military encounters struggle to reconcile certain reported movements with known engineering principles, then the mystery may involve something far stranger than unidentified aircraft alone. It may involve physics itself behaving in ways humanity does not yet fully understand. Modern aircraft obey unforgiving physical rules. Every movement through the sky carries measurable consequences. Acceleration generates heat. Sharp directional changes create crushing G-forces against both machinery and human bodies. Engines leave detectable exhaust signatures. Aerodynamic surfaces interact predictably with atmosphere, gravity, and momentum. Aerospace engineering advances continuously, yet every aircraft ever built still operates within those boundaries. That is why certain Pentagon-linked reports disturbed scientists and military analysts so deeply. According to multiple encounters, some unidentified objects appeared to ignore the rules entirely. The documentary reconstructs these incidents slowly, allowing the emotional tension to emerge through technical detail rather than dramatic narration. Radar operators tracked objects descending tens of thousands of feet in seconds before stopping abruptly above the ocean surface. Pilots described silent craft, hovering motionless against powerful winds without visible means of propulsion. Infrared systems recorded movement patterns inconsistent with known heat signatures expected from conventional engines. And again, witnesses described acceleration that should not have been survivable. If the reported movements were real, humanity was observing technology that should not exist. That realization becomes emotionally overwhelming once scientists begin explaining the scale of the problem. A sudden directional shift at extreme velocity would generate forces capable of destroying ordinary aircraft instantly. Even advanced military jets remain constrained by inertia and structural limits. Pilots train extensively to withstand intense acceleration because human bodies themselves have physical breaking points. Yet some reported objects appeared unaffected by those limitations completely. One military encounter described an object accelerating from stationary hover to extraordinary speed almost instantly without visible transition. Another report involved a craft changing direction sharply at velocities, impossible for conventional aerospace engineering. In several cases, witnesses emphasized not only speed, but the eerie absence of expected physical effects. No sonic booms, no visible exhaust, no heat trails matching the observed maneuvers. That absence created profound scientific tension, because extraordinary movement alone might still suggest advanced classified technology. But extraordinary movement, without corresponding physical signatures, challenged deeper assumptions regarding propulsion, energy transfer, and aerodynamics themselves. Aerospace experts reviewing the reports admitted privately that certain descriptions seemed incompatible with known engineering principles. The documentary remains careful here. Sensor errors remain possible. Human perception can distort under unusual conditions. Classified military programs may exist beyond public awareness. Every rational explanation deserves consideration. Yet each explanation leaves contradictions behind that preserve the mystery instead of resolving it fully. If the data reflects equipment malfunction, why do multiple independent systems sometimes confirm the same anomaly simultaneously? If the encounters involve advanced secret aircraft, why do the reported maneuvers appear to exceed even theoretical limitations discussed publicly by aerospace scientists? If witnesses misinterpreted ordinary phenomena, why do similar movement patterns recur across generations of military testimony and radar records? The deeper investigators look, the more emotionally unstable certainty becomes. The atmosphere of the documentary grows almost dreamlike here. Silent objects drift across dark skies while scientific diagrams overlay radar imagery and infrared footage. Equations describing acceleration and inertia fade slowly into witness testimony describing movement that appears impossible according to those same principles. The audience feels suspended between rational analysis and expanding uncertainty. And perhaps that emotional contradiction explains why the phenomenon unsettles people so deeply. Human beings can confront ordinary danger more comfortably than violated expectation. The reports challenge assumptions modern civilization rarely questions openly. Physics itself feels stable and dependable. Aircraft move according to understandable systems. Cause and effect behave predictably. Yet certain encounters suggest the possibility of technology or phenomena operating beyond frameworks humanity currently recognizes fully. That idea creates both awe and discomfort simultaneously. Because if even a fraction of the observations are accurate, the implications extend far beyond unidentified aircraft alone. They point toward capabilities dramatically exceeding publicly known aerospace development. Not gradual improvement, a leap. And humanity does not yet know who or what stands behind that possibility. The documentary never claims certainty, because certainty still does not exist. Instead, it focuses on the psychological impact of confronting movement patterns that appear incompatible with ordinary understanding. The impossible no longer feels cinematic or fictional. It begins feeling disturbingly plausible precisely because trained observers, advanced sensors, and scientific analysis continue failing to dismiss it completely. By the end of the section, the audience no longer sees the mystery merely as unidentified objects crossing military airspace. The phenomenon now touches something deeper about human perception itself. If certain encounters truly involve behavior beyond current scientific frameworks, another question emerges naturally from the uncertainty surrounding them. Are human beings even fully equipped to interpret phenomena that may exist beyond the limits of present understanding? The mystery changes shape once again here. The documentary slowly turns away from radar systems, classified footage, and impossible flight maneuvers, moving instead towards something quieter and far more intimate. The human mind itself becomes part of the investigation. Because before humanity can understand unexplained phenomena, humanity must first confront a more uncomfortable question. How much of reality are human beings actually capable of understanding clearly? Perception feels immediate and trustworthy. People experience the world through sight, sound, memory, and interpretation so naturally that reality itself appears stable and complete. Yet history repeatedly demonstrates how limited human understanding can be when confronting phenomena existing outside familiar conceptual frameworks. There was a time when microscopic life remained invisible and unimaginable. Disease moved silently through civilizations because humanity lacked the tools to perceive what caused it. Radiation existed long before humans discovered it. Entire galaxies filled the night sky for thousands of years. while civilizations believed the universe ended just beyond visible stars. Reality remained unchanged during those periods, only human perception changed. That realization creates emotional humility. The greatest barrier may not be distance in space, but the limits of how humans understand reality itself. The narration becomes calmer and more reflective now, guiding viewers away from certainty instead of toward it. Scientists and psychologists carefully suggest that unidentified phenomena may expose limitations not only in technology, but in cognition itself. Human beings instinctively seek stable explanations because uncertainty produces psychological discomfort. The unknown unsettles perception deeply, forcing the mind to choose between interpretation and denial. Throughout history, societies often responded to unexplained experiences in remarkably similar ways. Some transformed anomalies into mythology or spiritual symbolism. Others dismissed them entirely to preserve existing worldviews. Very few cultures comfortably tolerated prolonged uncertainty. Human psychology prefers categories. Things must become natural phenomena, advanced technology, hallucination, intelligence, fiction, or misunderstanding. The mind searches constantly for recognizable structure because ambiguity feels emotionally unstable. Yet the UFO phenomenon appears to resist categorization repeatedly. That may be why the subject generates such intense disagreement across society. The phenomenon seems to exist somewhere between the categories civilization depends upon to organize reality comfortably. It touches technology, yet behaves unlike ordinary machines. It produces psychological effects, yet occasionally leaves measurable radar data behind. It invites scientific analysis while simultaneously provoking mythological interpretation and existential fear. The audience slowly begins sensing that humanity may struggle with the mystery not because evidence is absent, but because the phenomenon occupies conceptual territory difficult for the human mind itself to process clearly. That possibility becomes deeply unsettling. Perhaps unidentified phenomena reveal something profound about the structure of perception. Human beings evolved to survive within ordinary environments, not necessarily to interpret every layer of reality objectively. The senses filter enormous amounts of information constantly. Memory reshapes experience unconsciously. Cultural expectations influence interpretation more than people realize. Even scientific observation depends upon frameworks built through previous understanding. The documentary carefully avoids turning this into pure relativism or mystical speculation. Reality still exists independently of perception. Radar systems detect measurable movement. Witnesses report recurring patterns. Physical laws govern ordinary experience reliably. But the narration gently suggests that human understanding may remain incomplete in ways civilization rarely acknowledges openly. And perhaps that incompleteness becomes visible precisely at the edges of mysteries like this one. The emotional atmosphere grows almost meditative near the end of the section. The audience is no longer pushed toward conclusions. Instead, viewers are invited to sit quietly with uncertainty itself. The documentary suggests there may be value in resisting immediate answers, especially when confronting phenomena that challenge ordinary assumptions about technology, intelligence, and perception simultaneously. Somewhere between belief and skepticism exists another territory entirely. A place where human beings confront the edges of their own understanding without fully crossing beyond them. That is where the mystery now seems to live. Not fully proven, not fully dismissed, suspended between observation and interpretation, existing just clearly enough to provoke fascination while remaining incomplete enough to preserve doubt. The phenomenon becomes less about discovering one final answer and more about recognizing how fragile certainty itself may actually be. And as the chapter closes quietly beneath drifting stars and fading radar signals, another transformation begins emerging from the mystery's long shadow across modern history. The phenomenon was no longer confined to classified files and military encounters alone. It had already begun reshaping culture, imagination, fear, and humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. For decades, the phenomenon existed inside an unusual cultural space, where fascination and ridicule lived side by side. Newspapers published strange sightings beside comic strips. Television hosts laughed while discussing mysterious lights over military bases. Films imagined alien visitors arriving dramatically from deep space, while governments publicly denied serious interest in unidentified aerial encounters altogether. The subject drifted through modern culture like something half believed and half dismissed at the same time. yet it never disappeared. That detail matters more than it first appears. Many cultural obsessions fade naturally once public attention moves elsewhere, but the UFO phenomenon survived generation after generation despite ridicule, failed predictions, hoaxes, and skepticism. The reason may be deeply human. Beneath every joke, conspiracy theory, and science fiction story remained a quieter emotional truth. Humanity could never completely stop wondering. The narration slowly explores how public perception evolved across decades. In the early modern era, unidentified flying objects often belonged to pulp magazines, late-night radio programs, and sensational newspaper headlines. The stories felt entertaining precisely because they existed safely outside ordinary reality. Strange craft in the sky became part of cultural mythology rather than accepted possibility. Then, popular culture transformed the mystery further. Movies imagined extraterrestrial intelligence, observing humanity from above. Television series blended government secrecy with cosmic uncertainty. Books explored hidden conspiracies involving military cover-ups and advanced civilizations beyond Earth. Entire generations grew up surrounded by stories connecting unidentified objects with hidden knowledge, existential fear, and the possibility that humanity might not stand alone in the universe. And gradually, fiction itself began shaping public expectation. That relationship became psychologically complicated over time. Once people absorbed decades of cultural imagery involving alien spacecraft and secret government programs, every real-world report entered a landscape already filled with expectation and symbolism. The audience slowly realizes that culture itself became part of the mystery. Fiction influenced perception, while real Pentagon disclosures later blurred the line between imagination and reality in unsettling ways. The emotional tension deepened once military footage and official investigations entered mainstream discussion publicly. Scenes that once belonged entirely to science fiction suddenly appeared during news broadcasts delivered calmly by respected journalists and former intelligence officials. The same imagery associated with entertainment for generations now existed beside congressional hearings and classified military analysis. Reality started resembling fiction just enough to create discomfort. The documentary carefully explores another important psychological layer beneath the ridicule surrounding the subject. Laughter itself may have functioned as a defense mechanism. Human beings often joke about uncertainty because humor reduces emotional tension. Mocking unexplained phenomena allowed society to distance itself from possibilities that felt intellectually and existentially unsettling. Yet beneath the humor, fascination persisted continuously. Even skeptics watched the skies occasionally. People who dismissed UFO stories publicly still clicked on articles about military encounters late at night. The unknown continued attracting attention because it touched questions far larger than unidentified objects alone. The phenomenon became symbolic of humanity's deeper anxieties and hopes regarding existence itself. And slowly, cultural attitudes began changing. Younger generations increasingly approached the topic differently from earlier eras. Instead of reacting with immediate disbelief or embarrassment, many responded with curiosity and cautious openness. The rise of digital media, global communication, and constant access to information weakened traditional gatekeepers controlling public narratives. Pentagon disclosures entered a culture already accustomed to questioning official certainty. That shift created subtle emotional tension throughout society. The audience begins sensing that modern culture may be preparing psychologically for possibilities once considered absurd. Not necessarily extraterrestrial contact in dramatic cinematic form, but the broader realization that reality may contain phenomena humanity still struggles to explain comfortably. The ridicule surrounding the topic gradually softened because uncertainty itself became harder to dismiss completely. By the end of the section, UFOs no longer feel like isolated mysteries moving through empty skies. They have evolved into cultural symbols carrying enormous psychological weight. They represent fear of the unknown, longing for discovery, distrust of authority, fascination with hidden knowledge, and humanity's enduring desire to understand its place in the universe. The phenomenon survived not because everyone believed it. It survived because nobody could fully stop thinking about it. And as public fascination deepened across generations, another darker emotional question slowly emerged beneath the surface of the mystery. What if humanity fears unidentified phenomena not because they threaten civilization directly, but because they threaten humanity's belief that it stands confidently at the center of reality itself? The mystery affects people so deeply because it touches something older than modern governments, radar systems, or classified investigations. Beneath every debate about evidence, disclosure, or unidentified objects moving through military airspace exists another question entirely. A quieter one. A more human one. What if humanity does not fully understand the universe it lives inside? For most of history, civilizations place themselves at the center of existence naturally. Ancient cultures imagined the heavens revolving around Earth. Religious systems often described humanity as uniquely important within creation itself. The stars existed above human beings, but reality still felt emotionally organized around human meaning and perspective. Then science began changing that perception slowly. The Earth was no longer the center of the cosmos. The Sun itself became one ordinary star among billions scattered across enormous galaxies. Modern astronomy revealed a universe so vast that human civilization occupies only a microscopic fragment of visible existence. Each scientific breakthrough expanded knowledge while simultaneously shrinking humanity's sense of central importance. Yet even after those discoveries, people still retained one comforting belief. Reality remained understandable. The laws governing existence appeared stable and predictable. Human beings could observe, measure, and explain the universe gradually through science and reason. Mystery would continue shrinking beneath expanding knowledge, but the Pentagon UFO files introduce another psychological disruption entirely, because they suggest uncertainty may survive even inside the age of advanced surveillance and scientific analysis. The possibility that humanity is not alone may be less frightening than the possibility that humanity does not fully understand the universe it lives inside. That idea becomes the emotional center of the section. The fear surrounding unidentified phenomena may not truly originate from invasion scenarios or extraterrestrial threats. Those ideas belong mostly to fiction and entertainment. The deeper discomfort comes from perspective itself. Human beings prefer believing they understand the systems surrounding them. The possibility of unknown intelligence or even unknown physics threatens that emotional stability in subtle but profound ways. Because if something exists beyond current understanding, then certainty itself becomes fragile. The documentary carefully explores how differently people respond to this tension psychologically. Some become obsessed with disclosure, searching constantly for hidden answers capable of restoring clarity. Others reject the entire subject aggressively because uncertainty feels intolerable. Many fluctuate between fascination and skepticism simultaneously, drawn toward the mystery while resisting its implications emotionally. That contradiction keeps the phenomenon deeply human. A person may dismiss UFO reports publicly while privately reading about military encounters late at night. Another may desperately want confirmation of extraterrestrial life because the idea transforms ordinary existence into something larger and more meaningful. Others feel genuine fear not of aliens specifically, but of losing confidence in reality's stability altogether. The mystery becomes a psychological mirror, reflecting individual hopes, fears, and existential anxieties back toward humanity itself. The narration slows dramatically near the end of the section. Earth appears suspended in darkness viewed from orbit, while distant stars drift silently across the screen. Oceans, cities, wars, governments, and entire civilizations suddenly seem impossibly small against the scale of cosmic space surrounding them. That image creates both awe and vulnerability simultaneously. Humanity has achieved extraordinary things. It mapped the human genome, walked on the moon, created global communication networks, and built machines capable of observing distant galaxies billions of light years away. Yet despite those achievements, the species may still stand near the beginning of understanding rather than the end. And perhaps that realization frightens people more than they openly admit. Not because it makes humanity meaningless, but because it removes certainty. The documentary carefully avoids nihilism here. Smallness does not eliminate value. The universe can be vast while human experience remains deeply important. Yet the Pentagon UFO files force civilization to confront a possibility. Modern culture rarely discusses comfortably. Human beings may not occupy the highest position within reality's structure, intellectually, technologically, or perceptually. That possibility reshapes the mystery completely. UFOs no longer feel like simple questions about unidentified objects crossing the sky. They become symbols of humanity confronting the limits of its own understanding while staring into a universe far larger and stranger than previous generations imagined possible. And still, despite uncertainty, skepticism, ridicule, and decades without final answers, the mystery continues surviving generation after generation, which raises another haunting question quietly waiting beneath the surface. Why does the phenomenon refuse to disappear no matter how many times civilization tries to explain it away? The mystery should have disappeared by now. Modern civilization possesses technologies previous generations could barely imagine. Satellites observe Earth continuously from orbit. Artificial intelligence analyzes enormous amounts of data within seconds. Military radar systems monitor skies with extraordinary precision. Scientists understand the structure of galaxies, the movement of subatomic particles, and the chemistry of distant planets. And yet, despite all of that progress, unidentified phenomena continue surviving at the edges of human understanding. That persistence may be the most important detail of all. The mystery survived because every generation believed it might finally uncover the answer, and never fully did. The documentary slowly revisits the themes woven throughout the story. Government secrecy, military encounters, scientific uncertainty, ancient records, witness testimony, cultural fascination. At first, these elements appeared separate, almost disconnected from one another, but now they begin merging into something larger and more emotionally revealing. The phenomenon survives because it exists at the intersection of multiple human needs simultaneously. Human beings long for discovery. They fear uncertainty. They distrust hidden systems while remaining fascinated by them. They search constantly for signs that existence contains deeper meaning beyond ordinary survival. The UFO mystery touches all of those instincts at once, which may explain why it continues resurfacing across generations no matter how often civilization attempts to dismiss or explain it away completely. The audience begins sensing something profound beneath the phenomenon itself. Perhaps the mystery no longer depends entirely on definitive evidence. That idea changes the emotional atmosphere dramatically. The phenomenon persists not merely because unexplained sightings continue occurring, but because it activates something psychologically ancient within human consciousness. Since the earliest nights beneath open skies, human beings have looked upward into darkness, wondering whether something beyond them existed there. That instinct never disappeared. Ancient civilizations mapped stars searching for meaning in the heavens. Sailors crossed oceans guided by constellations. Astronomers built observatories to study distant lights moving across empty space. Modern radar systems continue scanning skies with similar emotional purpose beneath their technological sophistication. Humanity keeps searching because curiosity itself appears woven deeply into human nature, and somewhere inside that curiosity lives fear. Not fear of monsters descending from the sky, but fear that reality may remain larger and stranger than civilization comfortably understands. The documentary carefully avoids dramatic conclusions here because closure would weaken the emotional truth emerging slowly beneath the narrative. New reports continue appearing. Governments continue investigating quietly. Scientists continue debating unresolved data. Ordinary people continue witnessing things they struggle to explain. The phenomenon evolves with each generation while refusing to disappear entirely. That continuity creates an almost melancholic feeling near the end of the section. The audience begins realizing the documentary itself is not moving toward one final revelation waiting at the center of the mystery. Instead, it moves toward understanding why unanswered questions possess such enduring emotional power over human beings. Some mysteries survive because they remain unsolved. Others survive because they reflect something essential about the people confronting them. The UFO phenomenon may belong to both categories simultaneously. The narration grows softer now, almost hypnotic in tone. Across history, countless individuals stared upward into darkness, believing they lived near the edge of understanding. Yet every era eventually discovered larger mysteries waiting beyond previous certainty. The unknown continued expanding no matter how far human knowledge advanced. Perhaps that pattern never truly ends. The documentary does not ask viewers to believe every report or abandon skepticism. Instead, it asks something quieter. Why does the mystery continue gripping human imagination so deeply despite uncertainty, contradiction, ridicule, and incomplete evidence? Why do people keep returning to the subject generation after generation even while knowing definitive answers remain elusive? Maybe because the phenomenon represents more than unidentified objects alone. Maybe it represents humanity confronting the possibility that reality itself extends beyond current understanding in ways civilization cannot yet fully measure or explain. The final moments become still and reflective. A silent night sky stretches endlessly above oceans, cities, forests, and sleeping populations below. Stars remain distant and cold while radar systems continue scanning darkness quietly somewhere beneath them, and the narration leaves the audience with one final thought suspended inside the silence. Perhaps the mystery endures because humanity still has not reached the edge of what reality truly contains. And if that is true, another question waits just beyond it. What happens if the unknown can no longer remain hidden forever? The world would probably not end with panic. That is the first unsettling realization the documentary introduces as the chapter begins. Popular imagination often pictures dramatic scenes whenever humanity confronts the unknown directly. Sirens, chaos, governments collapsing beneath impossible revelations. But reality rarely transforms that way. Human civilization adapts slowly, even to extraordinary change. The deeper question may not be whether people panic, but whether people quietly stop understanding the world as clearly as they once believed they did. The narration slows almost to a whisper here, suspended between reflection and warning. What happens if undeniable evidence of unknown intelligence eventually emerges publicly? Not rumors, not blurred footage, not fragmented military testimony or classified uncertainty. Something undeniable, something impossible to dismiss psychologically once seen. The documentary carefully avoids cinematic invasion scenarios because the emotional weight comes from realism instead of spectacle. The audience is invited to imagine something subtler and perhaps more disturbing. A gradual collapse of certainty itself. The greatest shock may not come from what humanity discovers, but from realizing how unprepared humanity was to understand it. Civilization depends heavily upon stable frameworks of meaning. Governments maintain authority, partly through the assumption of control and understanding. Scientific institutions provide models explaining reality consistently enough for society to function predictably. Religious traditions offer moral and existential structure. Financial systems depend upon confidence. Ordinary people organize daily life around assumptions so familiar they become invisible. Now imagine those assumptions quietly weakening. The documentary carefully explores how different parts of society might react if reality suddenly expanded beyond familiar categories. Some individuals would feel wonder and exhilaration. Others would experience denial, fear, or existential confusion. Certain religious groups might reinterpret ancient beliefs through entirely new perspectives. Scientific institutions would confront pressure to explain phenomena previously dismissed or marginalized. Governments might struggle less with secrecy itself than with maintaining social stability during prolonged uncertainty. And perhaps most unsettling of all, humanity may not react together. That emotional fragmentation becomes central to the section. A revelation affecting civilization globally would still pass through billions of individual minds, shaped by culture, ideology, fear, belief, and personal psychology. Some people would obsessively search for answers. Others would reject the phenomenon completely regardless of evidence. Many would continue ordinary life outwardly, while privately feeling something fundamental had shifted beneath reality itself. The documentary suggests that disclosure may never arrive through one clean announcement delivered from a podium beneath bright lights. Reality may not change that neatly. Instead, certainty could erode gradually over time until disbelief simply becomes harder to maintain emotionally than uncertainty itself. In some ways, that process may already have begun. The Pentagon Files, congressional hearings, scientific discussion, military testimony. Each fragment weakens the old assumption that unidentified phenomena belong entirely to fiction or misunderstanding. Civilization adjusts incrementally rather than all at once. People continue working, sleeping, scrolling through phones, and living ordinary lives while deeper assumptions quietly change beneath the surface. That gradual transformation feels psychologically realistic in ways sudden revelation does not. Because human beings normalize extraordinary things surprisingly quickly, once repetition replaces shock. What once sounded impossible eventually becomes familiar through exposure. Yet beneath that familiarity, emotional consequences continue accumulating silently. The audience begins sensing how fragile normal reality might feel if humanity suddenly understood that something else had been observing the world far longer than anyone realized. And still, the documentary refuses certainty. No definitive answers appear. The narration never claims extraterrestrial intelligence exists conclusively or predicts specific outcomes. Instead, It explores emotional possibility itself. The purpose is not to convince viewers of one interpretation, but to prepare them psychologically for uncertainty beyond ordinary cultural experience. The atmosphere becomes almost dreamlike near the end. Cities glow quietly beneath orbiting satellites, while distant radar stations continue scanning dark skies. Human civilization appears fragile and temporary against the scale of existence surrounding it. The audience begins realizing the mystery no longer feels like speculative entertainment or abstract philosophical curiosity. It feels like preparation. Preparation for a threshold humanity may eventually approach whether it wants to or not. Because if the phenomenon truly exists in some unresolved form, another question emerges naturally from the silence surrounding it. Why has it remained hidden at the edges of certainty for so long? Why appear only in fragments, incomplete encounters, and fleeting observations instead of revealing itself clearly? And perhaps more unsettling still, what if ambiguity itself is part of the phenomenon? The phenomenon behaves strangely, not only in how it moves through the sky, but in how it exists within human awareness itself. That realization slowly becomes one of the most psychologically unsettling parts of the entire documentary. Because after decades of sightings, military encounters, scientific analysis, and public fascination, one pattern continues returning with eerie consistency. The mystery always seems to stop just short of certainty. Witnesses observe objects briefly before they disappear. Radar systems capture fragments of impossible movement without complete visual confirmation. Cameras record distant shapes lacking definitive detail. Encounters occur at night, above oceans, inside storms, or during moments too fleeting to fully process. Governments investigate seriously while still avoiding final conclusions. The phenomenon remains visible enough to provoke fascination, yet incomplete enough to preserve doubt. And that raises a disturbing possibility. What if the mystery survives not because humanity failed to solve it, but because humanity was never meant to observe it completely? The documentary approaches this question carefully, allowing emotional tension to emerge naturally through historical patterns rather than dramatic claims. Across generations, unidentified phenomena repeatedly appear under ambiguous conditions. A pilot glimpses a silent object for seconds before it accelerates away. A radar operator tracks impossible movement that vanishes abruptly from the screen. Civilians report strange lights hovering motionless before disappearing into darkness without leaving stable evidence behind. The pattern itself becomes difficult to ignore. Human beings assume advanced intelligence would behave according to familiar expectations. Either something openly reveals itself, or it remains fully hidden. Yet the observed phenomenon seems to occupy an unsettling middle ground between visibility and invisibility. It appears. It interacts indirectly. It leaves fragments behind, but complete clarity never arrives. The audience begins sensing something profoundly strange about that structure. Perhaps the ambiguity is accidental. Human technology still has limitations. Cameras fail under difficult conditions. Witnesses misinterpret brief encounters. Governments classify information aggressively. All of those explanations remain possible and reasonable. Yet each one leaves emotional gaps behind that prevent the mystery from settling comfortably into ordinary understanding. And slowly, another possibility enters the narrative. What if the phenomenon itself behaves in ways designed to avoid full comprehension? The documentary never claims this directly. Instead, it allows the idea to linger quietly inside the audience's imagination. Certain encounters seem oddly calibrated, visible enough to provoke reaction, elusive enough to prevent resolution. The phenomenon behaves less like an object waiting to be discovered, and more like something maintaining psychological distance, intentionally or naturally. That possibility becomes even more unsettling through a comparison drawn from nature itself. Human beings observe animals constantly without fully communicating with them. Marine researchers study deep ocean life carefully from a distance, tracking movement patterns and behavior without announcing themselves openly every moment. Wildlife biologists monitor species through indirect observation while remaining largely outside the awareness of the creatures they study. The analogy creates immediate emotional discomfort, because it quietly reframes humanity's position within the mystery. For centuries, civilization assumed human beings occupied the highest observational position on Earth. Humans studied reality, humans observed nature, humans searched the skies. But what happens psychologically once humanity imagines itself potentially becoming the observed instead of the observer? The narration becomes slower and almost hypnotic here. Silent oceans drift beneath moonlight, while radar signals pulse faintly across military screens. The audience begins sensing that the phenomenon's greatest power may not lie in advanced propulsion or impossible movement alone. Its greatest power may be psychological distance. It remains close enough to provoke endless fascination, scientific analysis, cultural obsession, and existential fear. Yet it stays distant enough to preserve uncertainty permanently. That balance keeps humanity emotionally suspended between skepticism and belief without ever allowing stable resolution. And perhaps that tension itself explains why the mystery has endured for so long. Complete absence would eventually erase public interest. Complete certainty would end the mystery entirely. Instead, the phenomenon occupies the narrow space between those extremes, where curiosity survives generation after generation without closure. The unknown no longer feels absent by the end of the section. It feels deliberately incomplete. Whether that incompleteness results from technological limitation, institutional secrecy, human perception, or something deeper, remains unresolved intentionally. The documentary understands that uncertainty itself now forms part of the emotional structure surrounding the phenomenon. Every unanswered question creates another layer of fascination instead of ending the search. And despite decades of ambiguity, failed explanations, ridicule, and incomplete evidence, humanity continues looking upward. Which leads naturally toward another question, hidden beneath the mystery itself. Why do people keep searching for answers, even when certainty always seems just beyond reach? Long before radar, governments, or classified files, humanity was already staring into the night sky, asking the same question. The documentary slows almost completely now. The mystery no longer feels confined to military encounters or unidentified objects crossing restricted airspace. It has become something older and more deeply human than that. Across every civilization, every era, and every technological age, people have looked upward, searching for meaning beyond immediate survival. Ancient cultures mapped constellations across dark skies, long before understanding what stars truly were. Sailors crossed dangerous oceans, guided by distant points of light, suspended above endless water. Astronomers spent entire lifetimes studying tiny movements in the heavens because they sensed reality extended far beyond the world directly visible around them. Modern scientists launch telescopes into orbit, searching galaxies billions of light years away, while military radar systems continue scanning Earth's atmosphere for anomalies they still cannot fully explain. The instinct remains unchanged. Humanity keeps looking upward. That realization becomes the emotional center of the section. The UFO mystery survives not merely because unexplained sightings continue occurring, but because the phenomenon activates something psychologically ancient inside human consciousness itself. Curiosity, wonder, fear, the longing to understand whether existence contains something larger waiting beyond the boundaries of ordinary life. And perhaps it always has. The narration reflects quietly on how every generation believed it stood near the edge of ultimate understanding. Ancient civilizations thought the stars revolved around Earth. Early scientists believed the visible galaxy represented most of existence. Modern humanity built advanced technological systems, convinced reality would eventually surrender all remaining mysteries beneath enough observation and data. Yet reality continued expanding beyond previous limits every time. That pattern feels strangely connected to the Pentagon files themselves. The mystery survives not because humanity lacks intelligence, but because existence may always contain layers beyond immediate comprehension. Every answer opens larger questions behind it. Every horizon reveals another horizon waiting farther beyond. The phenomenon becomes symbolic of that endless expansion between knowledge and uncertainty, shaping human history itself. The audience begins understanding something subtle and emotional here. Perhaps the search matters as much as the answer. That idea transforms the atmosphere of the documentary completely. Human beings are not defined only by what they know. They are also defined by what they continue seeking despite uncertainty. The impulse to search the skies, study distant galaxies, investigate anomalies, and confront the unknown may reveal something essential about humanity itself. Curiosity survives, even when certainty fails. The visuals become almost dreamlike now. Cities sleep beneath stars while distant radar stations pulse softly in the darkness. Archival footage fades slowly into oceans reflecting moonlight. Fighter pilots, astronomers, ancient skywatchers, and ordinary people standing silently beneath open skies begin feeling emotionally connected across generations. Humanity appears small, fragile, and endlessly curious all at once. And perhaps that combination is beautiful in its own way. The documentary carefully avoids offering comfort through final conclusions. No definitive revelation emerges. The mystery remains unresolved intentionally because unresolved questions continue driving human imagination forward. People keep searching not only because they expect answers, but because searching itself creates meaning. Somewhere inside that truth exists a quiet melancholy. Civilizations rise believing they understand reality clearly, only to discover larger structures waiting beyond current perception. Human beings build technologies capable of observing distant planets, while still struggling to explain certain objects crossing Earth's own skies. The unknown remains present no matter how far knowledge advances. Yet humanity continues looking upward anyway. That persistence may reveal more about the species than any single encounter or classified report ever could. The desire to confront mystery, despite uncertainty, appears woven deeply into human nature. It existed before modern science, before governments, before radar systems, and it will likely survive long after current debates surrounding unidentified phenomena eventually change again. The final moments feel still and suspended between wonder and loneliness. Earth drifts quietly beneath endless darkness, while stars remain distant beyond imagination. Somewhere below, ordinary people continue living ordinary lives, unaware of the unanswered questions lingering silently above them. And perhaps that is where the mystery ultimately belongs. Not only in classified files or military encounters, but inside humanity's endless need to search beyond the edges of certainty itself. As the chapter closes, another realization begins emerging, slowly from the darkness surrounding the phenomenon. The mystery may no longer be something humanity can fully ignore much longer. The Earth never changed. That is how the final chapter begins, not with revelation, panic, or dramatic transformation, but with quiet continuity. Cities still glow beneath clouds late at night. Oceans continue moving in darkness beyond sleeping coastlines. Satellites circle silently overhead while airplanes cross familiar flight paths through ordinary skies. Millions of people wake each morning, drive to work, scroll through phones, speak with family, and fall asleep again beneath the same stars humanity has always known. And yet something feels different now. The world continued exactly as before, except humanity could no longer pretend the mystery did not exist. The narration moves slowly through this realization, almost weightlessly. After everything explored throughout the documentary, military encounters, classified investigations, impossible flight characteristics, scientific uncertainty, historical echoes, existential fear, the audience returns finally to ordinary life itself. But ordinary life no longer feels entirely ordinary, because somewhere above the same cities and oceans where humanity continues its routines, unresolved phenomena may still exist quietly beyond full understanding. That emotional contrast creates a strange atmosphere throughout the section. Civilization appears stable and familiar on the surface. Traffic lights change, news broadcasts continue, financial markets open every morning. Yet hidden beneath that normality lingers another awareness impossible to fully erase once considered seriously. The Pentagon Files confirmed genuine uncertainty. Witnesses described encounters they could not explain. Governments investigated secretly for decades. Scientists cautiously entered the conversation despite reputational risk. And still, no final answer arrived. The documentary revisits these truths carefully, without repeating them directly. Instead, they drift through the narration like fragments of memory settling into place emotionally rather than intellectually. The audience slowly realizes the mystery was never resolved because perhaps resolution was never the point. That possibility becomes the major emotional shift of the section. Human beings instinctively assume unanswered questions are temporary. Every mystery feels like a problem, waiting for enough information, enough technology, or enough time to solve eventually. Modern civilization depends heavily upon that belief. Uncertainty becomes tolerable because people imagine certainty always waiting somewhere ahead. But what if some mysteries endure permanently? Not because humanity fails intellectually, but because reality itself may contain dimensions that never fit neatly into complete understanding. The documentary gently suggests that the UFO phenomenon may belong to that category, a mystery existing alongside civilization rather than one destined for simple resolution. That realization feels strangely calming and unsettling at the same time. The audience begins understanding the documentary was never truly about proving extraterrestrial life conclusively. It was about confronting uncertainty honestly inside a world increasingly obsessed with prediction, surveillance, and control. Human beings built systems designed to map reality completely, yet certain questions continue surviving at the edges of comprehension anyway. And perhaps there is something emotionally important about acknowledging that openly. The narration grows softer now. Earth appears from orbit again, suspended silently in darkness while storms drift across continents below. Borders disappear from this distance. Governments, ideologies, and debates seem temporary compared to the scale of existence surrounding the planet itself. Humanity looks small, not insignificant, just unfinished. That distinction matters deeply near the end of the documentary. The mystery no longer feels threatening in the traditional sense. Instead, it feels reflective, almost philosophical. The unresolved phenomena become symbols of humanity's ongoing relationship with the unknown. Every generation believes it understands reality more clearly than the last. Yet each era eventually encounters questions expanding beyond previous certainty again. The Pentagon Files simply forced modern civilization into another one of those moments. And once the mystery enters awareness seriously, reality itself changes slightly afterward. The audience senses this emotionally rather than logically. Night skies feel different. Silence feels deeper. Ordinary existence acquires a faint layer of uncertainty impossible to remove completely. Not fear, awareness. Somewhere above sleeping cities and endless oceans, radar systems continue searching. Military personnel continue monitoring skies. Scientists continue debating unresolved observations. Ordinary people continue witnessing things they cannot fully explain. The world moves forward normally, while the mystery remains quietly unfinished beside it. Perhaps that coexistence is the real story. The final moments become still and reflective. Earth rotates beneath distant stars while faint lights flicker across continents below. Humanity appears suspended between extraordinary technological achievement and profound uncertainty simultaneously. And as the chapter settles into silence, one final question begins emerging slowly from the darkness surrounding the planet. What if humanity's understanding of reality is still only beginning? The documentary reaches its deepest question here, though it still refuses to provide a final answer. After decades of secrecy, military encounters, scientific uncertainty, cultural obsession, and philosophical reflection, one possibility remains impossible to avoid completely. What if reality is larger than humanity currently understands? The narration asks the audience not to believe, but simply to imagine. Imagine that somewhere within the vastness surrounding Earth, forms of intelligence, technology, or phenomena exist beyond present human comprehension. Not necessarily hostile, not necessarily extraterrestrial in the simplistic sense popular culture imagined for generations. Just something genuinely unknown operating beyond the boundaries of familiar understanding. That possibility alone changes everything psychologically. The files may not have revealed what the phenomenon is, but they revealed something equally unsettling. Humanity's understanding of reality may still be incomplete. The emotional tension rises slowly through reflection rather than spectacle. Every explanation considered throughout the documentary carries implications profound enough to reshape civilization emotionally. If humanity is not alone, then the human story changes forever. If advanced, unknown technology exists somewhere beyond public awareness, then modern history enters an era of profound uncertainty. And if the phenomenon represents misunderstood natural forces or dimensions of physics civilization still struggles to perceive, then reality itself may be stranger than current scientific frameworks comfortably allow. There is no safe explanation anymore. That realization becomes one of the final emotional revelations of the documentary. For decades, unidentified aerial phenomena survived mostly as entertainment because the mystery felt distant enough to ignore casually. But the Pentagon Files transformed the conversation. Governments acknowledged uncertainty. Scientists entered the discussion cautiously. Military witnesses described impossible encounters seriously. The phenomenon no longer belonged entirely to fiction or conspiracy culture. It became intellectually unavoidable. And perhaps that is why the mystery unsettles people so deeply now. Human beings depend emotionally upon stable assumptions about reality. People want the universe to feel understandable even when enormous and mysterious. Yet the possibility emerging beneath the Pentagon investigations quietly threatens that emotional stability. The audience begins sensing that the true discomfort surrounding the phenomenon may not come from extraterrestrials or advanced technology specifically. It comes from incompleteness. The realization that civilization may still stand near the beginning of understanding rather than the end. The documentary carefully explores another contradiction woven deeply into human nature itself. People fear uncertainty constantly, yet they are also drawn toward it with equal intensity. Mystery creates anxiety, but it also gives existence depth and wonder. Humanity searches for answers because uncertainty feels unbearable, yet a universe completely stripped of mystery would feel emotionally empty in ways difficult to describe. Perhaps that is why the phenomenon continues holding such power over imagination across generations. It reminds human beings that reality may still contain undiscovered layers waiting beyond current perception. The unknown no longer feels distant or abstract here. It feels woven quietly into existence itself, surrounding ordinary life invisibly, while humanity continues searching for meaning beneath familiar skies. The narration grows almost hypnotic near the end of the section. Galaxies drift silently across darkness, while faint radar pulses echo beneath the soundtrack like distant signals searching endlessly through empty space. Earth appears suspended between knowledge and mystery, carrying billions of people across a universe they may still barely understand. That image creates both awe and vulnerability simultaneously. Human civilization achieved extraordinary things. It built telescopes capable of observing the birth of stars. It decoded the structure of life itself. It placed machines on distant planets. Yet despite those achievements, the species may still confront phenomena, challenging the limits of current understanding in ways both subtle and profound. And perhaps that realization should not produce despair. Perhaps it should produce humility. The documentary never asks viewers to abandon skepticism or accept extraordinary claims blindly. Instead, it invites them into a quieter emotional space where uncertainty can exist without immediate resolution. The Pentagon Files matter not because they confirmed one final answer, but because they forced modern civilization to confront the possibility that certainty itself may always remain incomplete. The audience no longer feels like it stands at the center of understanding. It stands at the edge of it, and maybe humanity always has. The final moments become vast and dreamlike. Endless stars drift silently, while Earth glows faintly beneath moving clouds and scattered city lights. Somewhere below, radar systems continue scanning dark skies. Scientists continue searching for patterns. Witnesses continue remembering encounters they cannot explain fully. And still, after everything revealed throughout the documentary, one thing remains unchanged. The silence surrounding the mystery itself, which is where the story finally begins moving next. Not toward answers, toward the silence that still remains. In the end, the mystery returns to silence. Not dramatic silence, not the silence of catastrophe or revelation, a quieter silence. The kind that has always existed above oceans at night, across empty deserts beneath cold stars, and inside dark military control rooms where radar screens continue glowing softly long after conversations end. Earth remains exactly where it has always been. Cities still shine beneath clouds. Aircraft cross familiar skies carrying sleeping passengers through darkness. Ocean waves move slowly beneath moonlight while satellites drift silently overhead. Humanity continues its routines much as before, surrounded by ordinary life and ordinary concerns. And yet the world feels slightly different now. The mystery never truly ended. Humanity simply learned to live beneath it. The narration slows almost to a whisper here, allowing the emotional weight of everything explored throughout the documentary to settle quietly into place. Decades of investigations, military encounters, Pentagon disclosures, congressional hearings, scientific uncertainty, witness testimony, cultural obsession. All of it led not toward final revelation, but toward something more subtle and strangely human, acceptance of uncertainty itself. That realization changes the emotional meaning of the story completely. The absence of definitive answers no longer feels like failure. Instead, it becomes part of the larger human experience stretching across history. Every civilization believed it stood near complete understanding eventually. Ancient cultures interpreted the heavens through gods and mythologies. Modern civilization trusted technology to illuminate every remaining darkness. Yet, uncertainty survived both worlds. Something continues appearing at the edges of explanation no matter how far knowledge advances. The phenomenon may change form across generations. The language surrounding it evolves. Radar systems replace ancient star maps. Scientific theories replace spiritual interpretation. But the essential emotional experience remains strangely familiar. Humanity confronts something it cannot fully explain, and perhaps it always will. The documentary carefully reframes the mystery one final time here. Its greatest significance may never involve proving extraterrestrial life conclusively or uncovering hidden technology buried inside classified programs. Those questions remain unresolved. What matters more profoundly may be the way the unknown preserves humanity's relationship with wonder itself, because wonder requires incompleteness. A universe where every mystery disappears entirely would also lose something essential. Curiosity would shrink. Imagination would narrow. Human beings would stop looking beyond the edges of certainty, searching for larger meaning. The unknown forces civilization to remain humble enough to recognize that reality may always extend farther than current understanding allows. That humility becomes strangely peaceful near the end. The audience no longer feels trapped between belief and skepticism. Instead, viewers drift into a quieter emotional space where uncertainty exists naturally beside ordinary life. The mystery does not demand immediate answers anymore. It simply remains present, woven softly into the background of existence itself. The atmosphere becomes deeply reflective and melancholic. Ocean waves move endlessly beneath pale moonlight. Radar screens flicker in distant military rooms where unknown signals occasionally still appear and vanish. Somewhere above the clouds, stars continue shining exactly as they did long before humanity built governments, telescopes, or theories about the universe. The cosmos remains silent, but not empty. That distinction lingers carefully inside the final moments of the documentary. Human beings may never fully solve the mystery. Complete understanding may always remain slightly beyond reach, hidden somewhere between perception and reality, knowledge and imagination, certainty and wonder. And perhaps that is why the phenomenon endures emotionally across generations. Not because humanity expects final answers, but because something inside human nature refuses to stop asking the question. The narration becomes almost weightless now. Earth drifts slowly through darkness surrounded by endless stars, while scattered lights flicker faintly across continents below. Billions of people sleep beneath skies they barely notice anymore, unaware of the unresolved silence stretching endlessly above them. And somewhere within that silence, the question remains. Not answered, not forgotten, still waiting. The documentary ends without closure because the mystery itself never offered any. It leaves the audience suspended exactly where humanity has always existed between skepticism and wonder, fear and curiosity, knowledge and the vast unknown still waiting beyond it.